Hello and welcome to today's Wolfram Institute live stream. Today we're joined with the esteemed Sam Senchal, runs an investment firm in London, has enjoyed studying the Cabal, math, physics. He collects art, and we're actually, me and him are collaborating with artists in London to do an art show featuring aperiodic tilings. He attended Wolfram Summer School in 2023, worked on the overlap of the Ruliad with religion, focusing on observers like us. Today he will be presenting the God Conjecture, talking about cosmogenesis, computation, mathematics, connecting the Ruliad to observer theory, and together the two languages of science and meaning. Sam, welcome.
That was a great intro, thanks.
Um,
Um, so yeah, thanks Dugan, and
mm,
also big thank you to James Wiles, who I imagine without him I probably wouldn't have done any of this work. So big thanks to James. So just to set it up, I guess the background to this paper is this was something that when I came to summer school and I spent, I don't know, 12, 15 hours and very late at night with Stephen talking about how sort of religious cosmogenesis, which is how the metaphysics of religions describe how creation happened. And it applies to sort of things like Platonism as well, and logos and demiurge, but how they map to ideas within the Ruliad, because the Ruliad is a really, really big infinity that we can probe. And that is unusual. And it's become sort of, for me, the lingua franca of talking about this stuff because you can do things with it that weren't possible before, and you can make explicit statements that perhaps weren't possible in the language of people writing sort of Kabbalistic metaphysics in the 16th century, or Aquinas writing about Christian metaphysics in the 15th century. You just can't do it before you have this language. And so, over the course of the past 2 years, I have sent a couple of very ropey drafts of this to James, who has given me some homework and reading. And in May, I published an extension to observer theory, which was really a top-down view of what observers do in the Ruliad. And that's all classes of observers, not just observers like us, even though I use some anthropomorphic framing to sort of bring it home. And this paper builds on that to say what I was trying to say 2 years ago, which is something like, with the construction of the Ruliad, with very few additional assumptions or axioms, you can have a god concept, or at least a panentheistic god concept, be conciliant with this structure and work. And that means that you can get physics, because you can get physics out the Ruliad. You can create a shared language to talk about these sorts of ideas, because at least to me, the Ruliad is a giant map, or a giant multi-layered map. And this paper is about connecting the maps up. And it doesn't argue that God exists. This is not a proof argument. This is not like sort of a philosophical proof or Platinga style proof or anything like that. It's more a, this is how you can do it with this set of axioms, but it also admits sort of naturalistic explanations of this process. And really, the framing I want to start with is this is an observer-centric view of the world, right? So, and I don't mean observers like us, I just mean any possible observer. So I think, physics, at least my impression of physics, is it likes a view from nowhere. And this is saying that that view from nowhere is absolutely impossible, and that we approximate a view from nowhere, but we really don't get there, and that this is like the embedded view. And I'll walk through this presentation, but please, Dugan, James, anyone on the line, butt in with questions, because I'm conscious as I get through it, I'll be introducing a lot of words or concepts that might be less familiar to the audience of people here, particularly those from sort of the metaphysics of the religion I study, but also from other sort of other religions that come through here. So again, please interrupt, and I'll try and give you some plain English framing around those so you can connect them up together. And on that note, I'll kick off. So first, we'll set the scene. I think, the way I've come at this paper is that there is a massive disconnect, or the concept of sort of separate magisteria between science and religion, but really between the language of science, which I think is particles and forces, and the language of meaning. And those are purpose, consciousness, value. And even in the theories that we have of consciousness, and I'll list a few, like active inference, like IIT, like OR, they work at different levels of explanation, but they don't connect to those things that we have, like purpose and value, which I think is a really important thing in the world today. I think that, science should be answering sort of big questions. And in fact, the scientific method was, it's Descartes' favorite thing is like to see into the mind of God. That was like the major, the major thing in science. But we made a trade. Empiricism came out and it was really, really successful, but narrower. But it gave us much higher truthiness. And the Ruliad as an object is is an is something where you can do logic. You can say this is the abstract limit of all possible computations, and now I can use it as a shared canvas to model a God concept that can be mathematically compatible with the formalism of the Ruliad, and therefore eventually for a long chain compatible with the physics that the Wolfram Physics project outputs. Um, we I think here, we look at this sort of centuries of inquiries, and at the beginning, science and meaning sort of were very closely linked together, and some of those theories were very bad. And we've we've sort of got to a point where there are things that our equations can't capture. There are something like, I think, 26 or brute facts in physics, or fundamentals. Even philosophically, there are like 2 to 5 for materialism that have to be true as pure brute fact before you get to those constants. And they're still not answering sort of questions that I think underpin metaphysics and philosophy. you know why is there something rather than nothing is the key one, and at least to me. And I think it comes to something like, if there is if we come from a nothing, does that mean everything at the end is a nothing? And therefore, if we push to the last state before nothing, well, does that mean everything has no meaning that we do? Or is something coming from something? And religions, in a very rough way, argue that something comes from a much bigger something. And I'm going to be a bit mean and say postmodernism our answers, actually no, it's all relational, and it's actually nothing. It's actually nothing. We start from nothing, we build relationships, and it ends up as nothing. And I don't think that's a very healthy view, but it's personal preference. And I think we're standing at quite a unique moment in history, because what Stephen's done is, with the Ruliad, and I don't think he probably anticipated it would be used quite like this, has created something that's such a big language, in such a big thing that you can play with, that you can bridge these domains without necessarily reducing one to the other, without telling someone like Dugan, hey, turn off your error correcting machinery for a bit, because I'm going to now talk about religion, or I'm going to talk about sociology, or something else that's at the edges of empiricism. And I think that that's something that's really quite fun and quite cool that you can do with this. So I've just set out sort of on this page an epistemological timeline, right? And it's about really how, over sort of human history, how have we done things? So the top half of the graph looks at like top-down inquiry, which was before we got to science, really what we did. We used to think about things in our head, come up with stuff, and I've sort of seen occur shown on the top half, animism, shamanism, agricultural pantheon, urban polytheisms, early monotheisms, and then mature monotheisms and pantheisms, which is sort of the evolution of religious structure through our history. And then at the bottom, you've got bottom-up inquiry. Now, it's not to say that people didn't do any of it back in the day. There were proto attempts at science. They weren't very good, but they kind of kicked off quite late. And then science started to sort of the eat up the sort of explanation space. But it seems to reach a limit. There are things that science is very bad at answering, that religions seem to be very good at answering, which I think is why they're persistent in time. They have utility. depending, and it doesn't really matter what religion you subscribe to, if it's existent and if it's persistent and if it's still here, you are deriving some utility from that. And here we're looking at something where you can see in the top half of this graph, these sort of religious structures have become more and more complex or bigger. And so animism, as an example, is like, the spirit of this mountain, the spirit of that river, the domain within the Ruliad that it covers, or the coverage of that space, that computational possibility space, is small and it grows over time. And it's the same with science. Science started small, it started local, it grows now to, QM, the base of reality, quantum fields, they permeate everywhere. And these patterns are consistent across both top-down and bottom-up inquiry. So I'm just gonna, I know I'm speaking to the Wolfram Institute and I'm probably teaching people how to suck eggs when I tell them about the Ruliad and observer theory. And I know that's true for definitely some of the people listening. But I'll run through it reasonably fast. And again, Dugan, James, anyone, if you want to ask questions, please feel free, or you want to sort of interrupt and sort of query any of this. I use some of the things from the extension that I put together in May, but I'll walk through it reasonably quickly. The Ruliad as an idealized everything computation. It's a meta space containing every rule-based universe. The diagram on the right sort of shows the types of computation, so how they get more and more complex. And we're now sitting, thanks to Stephen, in this multi-computational land, which is the most complex. And I think, the Ruliad is not our physical universe. It's it's a formal limit object that you can model every possible multiversal structure in it to arbitrary accuracy with enough computational power. And that's sort of the way I'm using it within this. And I think we can use it as sort of a precise sort of backdrop or a precise canvas where you can model, where all possible models can coexist. Okay, the composition between those models might be exceptionally complex and might be very long, but in theory it should compose. I mean, that is reasonably how the Ruliad's formalism works when it's constructed. An observer is any subsystem doing computations within a persistent boundary inside the Ruliad. There are a few more things you can add to that definition, which we'll come on to later. And what I've said is this includes everything. So simple molecules to complex minds. The function, as far as I'm concerned, I'm reducing it to something very simple. I'm saying we sample information from the Ruliad, we update our internal state, and because observers have limited computational resources, they carve out a slice of the Ruliad, they coarse grain it, and that becomes their specific reality. That concept of coarse graining is a core concept of the Wolfram model, and it's predominantly due to computational boundedness, memory, time, memory and power, and persistence. How many hypergraph updates do I survive for? And you don't see the full picture of reality. You see it much more like pixels in a photo. And here we're going to build some lenses and filters for our observer for how it sees reality. And we're going to do that with things from the metaphysics of Judaism, but also we'll relate it to Hinduism and Taoism as well, just because it can be generalized to mostly any religion. So this isn't just the thing that I can do in Kabbalah. I could also do it in Christianity. I could do it in Islam. I'm just not expert enough on those traditions to do it with any meaningful accuracy that I can do it within Kabbalah. So just a quick diagram of how observers work. We have the entire Ruliad, which is gigantic and huge and maybe should be 10 times the size of this because we're one tiny piece of that, this observable part of the Ruliad. It's the sort of infinite line within this infinite circle that we can get to. And then we have our boundary, our observer, our internal model, and a sampling result. And this loop is something that basically every single observer from the most minimal to the most maximal must do to be an observer under the sort of R.C. Waller and formalism for a minimal observer.
But what's the output of an observer?
The output,
Yeah.
choice, morphism selection in the Ruliad. So if I'm state one, I take a reading, I take that, run it through my internal model. I pick a morphism I have access to into state two. And so that is choice in this model. So it's effectively I'm sampling these rules on state one, and then I'm sampling a different set of rules at state two, where most of those rules might be the same, and then some edge amount of rules will be different.
So it's an action taken. Is
Correct.
okay, like
And
basically
that's and that
an agent,
like that
maybe.
that's built into the minimal model as well, right? So the minimal model, the formalism builds that in with it. So and we can get to that, but it's so you state action, state space, update your internal model, run action, and do a loop. So we're gonna take the Ruliad, big R, and make it smaller. So the observable Ruliad in the field of observation, the observable Ruliad is a subset mapped by a sampling functor that maps the full Ruliad to what the observer can pass of it. This is, some very basic category theory. Different observers have access to different slices because they have different sampling functors. So they foliate the Ruliad in different ways. And this goes back to things that Stephen talks about alien minds, right? So when you have an alien mind, will we even recognize it because it's slicing it in such a different way to us? The field of observation within the observable Ruliad, the field of observation is a subset the observer is currently focusing on given their current computational boundedness and their current computational persistence. So R lowercase o is like the limit condition, the maximal unboundedness or maximum persistence. And FO is the smallest subset of that, which is where you are today. The field of observation is limited by boundedness, persistence, and this is part of the extension, a relevance filter. So because observers all have different internal models, and I can just pick people on this call who have slightly different internal models for how the world works, we all have different relevance filters. Now, a lot of that relevance filter might be the same. So we all need to breathe air. We all probably need to eat some food. That's always going to be relevant to all of us. But my, emotional landscape might be very different to say yours or James's or someone else's. Therefore, those aspects of things I sample might be different to you, and therefore I might weigh things with different relevance. In practice, the field is what observers attend to now. And you can use the example of a baby. A baby has access to a smaller field of observation than an adult, even though they both share similar sort of observable Ruliads in the limit. I guess the implication of this is only states satisfying the constraints appear in an observer's experience, and everything else is invisible to an observer at that moment in time. Now, at different levels of coarse graining, those things can be very big and there can be many of them, but generally you generally as you scale up or scale down, those states change. So that gives, you could have something like you have an abstract, Dugan, for example, could have an abstract knowledge of particle physics that I don't have. But that will be a very coarse grained slice unless he's looking at an actual equation or an output of a experiment somewhere on his screen. And but that will still be part of his observer experience, even if it's not being quite sampled. So it's still within the field of observation for Dugan.
Yeah, as
This is just
Michael Levin would say, the cognitive light cone.
you're looking at one now. This is my poor drawing of a cognitive light cone, and this is just to make it a bit more easy to sort of grok. So in the Wolfram Physics project, reality is discrete hypergraph updates. So I have a camera taking a snapshot. That is our observer. They are taking a snapshot at this time. Inside the pink line is the field of observation. This is the bit they're sampling between hypergraph updates. The limit is much bigger. You can imagine, if you can imagine a human enhanced by a Neuralink AI that lets them do computation much faster or lets them handle more than 50 bits in their conscious thought per second, you can imagine that R0, that FO growing towards R0 at the limit. And you're only running predictions over the field of observation. You're not running it over the entire observable Ruliad. So really, what you're focused on now is the difference, and that's what really want to take away from this sort of drawing and slide. This is a bit more on the constraints. I think, these are pretty basic. Boundedness has to, a state can only be sampled if its size complexity is below a threshold. The persistence, the state must remain unchanged long enough for observers to notice it, i.e., it requires the state persists for at least Y hypergraph updates, so fleeting events filtered out. And then the addition is the relevance predicate, which we've discussed. But I guess the thing that I want to sort of link this to is choice. So for high complexity, low computationally bounded observers, this is choice of morphisms. The appearance of free will within a deterministic Ruliad structure again comes back to we coarse grain, we can't predict enough, we make errors, therefore appearance of free will. So we're moving on here to a couple of other points from the observer theory extension. So cross-domain causation it maps straight is a meant you I think the way to think about this is there is no sort of causal problem in the Ruliad. The mind, a mental state, and a physical state are still part of this overall computational structure, and you can map this via functors that enable us to model top-down and bottom-up causation without breaking physics. And in fact, Eric Hoyle, who's just come out with a paper on causal emergence, which has now shown sort of how top-down causation and bottom-up causation can work together. So macro scale and micro scale causation can loop, and this has been shown in external papers now. The formal versus efficient causation. Formal causation is patterns restricting lower level outcomes. Efficient causation, lower level changes inducing high level effects. They're morphisms with increasing or decreasing rule constraint, and that's how you determine in the Ruliad, or at least in this formalism, what type of cause it is. So less constraints, formal cause, more constraints, efficient cause, and that's how you would just determine that delta.
So it's like
Now,
top-down constraints versus bottom-up emergence.
exactly, that's exactly right. So here, one of the things that is important to address is infinite regress. In an observer focus model, this is a philosophical problem. Who observes the observer? Turtles all the way down, etc. You've heard the phrase a million times. It's resolved here by taking sort of the compactifying point in infinity in an infinite groupoid and saying that that is the termination of all computations, i.e., there is always an ultimate perspective, even though a computationally bounded observer can never get there. And that is, I think, very important because it effectively means every computation effectively closes, every diagram commutes eventually. And here I've maybe poetically called it a true infinity, a point of infinity, and it's an unobservable ultimate observer perspective that closes this loop. It's like a compactifying point, the end point in the category of observers, right? The category of the observable Ruliad, and that makes it has impact, right? So in the formalism or in the category-theoretic formalism for the Ruliad, it's the thing that enables the Ruliad to generate geometry, math, eventually physics, right? You can't do it on an open category. It doesn't work. You have to have sort of this closed structure, and this infinite groupoid structure enables you to do that. So it has utility broadly in the Wolfram Physics project for all the sort of all the sort of infrageometry stuff you're doing. It has utility in observer theory as well for helping us map this model for observers.
So it's like appending the point at infinity, the complex plane to get the Riemann sphere kind of thing.
I
Like
mean,
this
yes,
idealized
but
limit.
it's an idealized limit that you can't get to within the system, but the system must have it to derive all of the stuff you derive from it, all the stuff you derive from the Ruliad. How do these tools fit together? I haven't finished the slide yet. Sorry. So I'm going to now set up the God conjecture, and I think to do this, I want to just take a second to think about what the arguments are and why people argue about this and continue to argue about it constantly. I think the debate's pretty stalled. Theists and atheists use incompatible frameworks based on incompatible axioms. And their arguments are internally consistent given a set of axioms they choose, but they're not neutral. And that's why both theists and atheists have what look like logically sound good arguments, but they always talk past each other. And what you can do with the Ruliad is, here I'm going to give you a conjecture that God can be real in sort of a Ruliad style universe, but you could equally say it's not real and use the same language and construct an atheist argument using computational language to do that. And it sort of overrides these opposing epistemologies that undergird these arguments. And on the right, I've sort of listed for theism and atheism some of those core things. So, principle sufficient reason is a core theist argument. Prior, no infinite regress, absolute grounding, detectable design, and then Platinga, which I think is a bit weak, but proper belief, i.e., if I think it's true, it's true. Atheism is things like absence of evidence, burden of proof, naturalism is fine, actually brute facts are fine, and evidentialism, and that comes to things like cosmological naturalism, evolution, etc. So all of these things sort of work together, and you kind of get this epistemological framework, what their ontological commitments are, and the core axioms, and those things determine the shapes of these arguments and how they fit together and how they combat each other. And what you find is that when theists and atheists often talk and argue, they actually just talk past each other because the basis of their argument is totally different. But what the Ruliad gives you is computation as a neutral language. And so you can set computation as a language and then work through the logic train for any argument you want. And the sort of ground is the same. And so those arguments can now engage in a much more productive way. Um, so the computational opportunity, I'm sort of abstracting a definition of computation to something that I think is intrinsic in the Ruliad. And when I think about computation in the Ruliad and sort of hypergraph update 1 to 2 to hypergraph update n, I think about cause and effect. And really, that's what I think you're tracing when you run rules in a Ruliad from, input, rule, output, you're doing cause and effect chains. And so I think the way I think about computation is, in this big structure, it's the logic of those cause and effect processes. And I think it leads you to be able to provide, to discuss concepts like necessity, consciousness, design, transcendence, both with a definition that's computational, i.e., it might not be the perfect definition, but you can get a lot further. And also, you don't need to pick sides. So you can do that and then work from those definitions that are in a shared language. So just as a sort of starter to get a flavor of how I'm thinking about these sorts of things, when I start to map theology to computational language, I can only do this with the Ruliad, right? This is impossible before the Ruliad exists, but I'll work through these because I think they're quite important for what we'll come on to. So things like necessity. What is necessity? In the computational universe, it's computation is necessary because denying computation exists requires a computation for the denial, i.e., it's a contradiction. So you can't you both it's like classic undergrad philosophy, right? um Divine simplicity, how does that map to something to the Ruliad? Despite containing infinite complexity, the Ruliad has an extremely simple definition. All possible fools for all possible steps taken to the limit. Okay, that's not perfect, but that is, there's I think, a very good summary if I was reducing the Ruliad's description down to something. Omnipotence, can model generate any possible reality because it contains all generative processes. Omniscience, contains all possible logic, information, and all computations that could process it. Omnipresence. Ruliad is everywhere as physical space emerges from the Ruliad plus observers. Transcendence and immanence. The whole Ruliad transcends any individual observer's sampling, yet every possible sampling exists within the Ruliad. And there we've just taken what I think are the core things that you talk about when you talk about God, or when theists or when philosophers talk about God, and you've given them pretty tight descriptions that map to how you look at this gigantic, huge object. And I think they map very logically, and then you can do things with them. So as we walk forward, when we get into the individual cosmogenesis and sort of how this God, how this infinite God could create a multiplicitous universe, these things will become quite important. So I want to just spend a second on religious evolution with a computational lens. So on the chart at the very beginning of the presentation, we sort of had the categories of these religions. And on this, I think what we see in sort of the history of mankind is religions have been there, or proto-religions at the very least have been there since we've been there. They start off quite simple. So the sort of level one of the computational power of a religion is animism. It's a narrow domain with narrow causal influence. So the river spirit of that river only has control around that river. The mountain spirit of that mountain only has control of that mountain, i.e., they're disconnected, they're like basic cellular automata. They only have narrow causal influence in the Ruliad.
Right. So
That
it's local
over time,
influence.
local, you're very local.
Mhm.
Level two, shamanism. So shamanism is the first sort of multi-level system. It's, shaman, upper world, lower world. And they get into meditative states to communicate between those worlds. There is more causal influence because you're covering more domains and more layers of the Ruliad, more layers of this map are accessible to this causal structure.
Right. So it's like they're trying to influence those local gods or something like that, those local
Yeah,
spirits.
so
It's like you're doing rain
exactly,
dances, you're or making sacrifices, you're communing.
exactly. It's like communing, and it's like effectively trying to exert some top-down causal influence on the lower level structure. Now, that might be very lossy, or it might have, no or very little causal influence most of the time, but it's effectively the observer taking their relevance filter and saying, I'm focusing on this. I'm pointing here. I want to look at these types of choices, these types of morphisms between states. And so that has more coverage over the Ruliad than animism. And that's what you see as you move forward. So we get to level three, agricultural pantheons. They're like periodic systems. They repeat every single year. They cover entire categories of things. Like, it could be like uh, hot. It could be like the sort of Egyptian pantheon of agricultural gods. I can't remember the name off the top of my head. Those evolve reasonably quickly to complex polytheisms, and so that's things like the Greek canon, Zeus, Poseidon, Aphrodite. These gods control whole domains. So Poseidon controls the sea. There's a hierarchy of those gods with different levels of causal control. And the sort of overall leader, there's in those domains start to be integrated, right? So they start to have connections between them. So they have these councils. Zeus is, can order Poseidon to do something, but he can't control the sea. Zeus can order Aphrodite to do something, she can't control love. So these gods have their own domain influence, but they're now in a connected structure with, effectively boundaries, right? So these are sort of how I think about them, and they're like multi-agent systems. Eventually you get to sort of the top level of this evolution, which is, monotheisms, right? Monotheisms, the early ones are like universal Turing machines, right? So when monotheisms emerged, they were normally emergent from henotheistic traditions. Henotheistic traditions are, I have one God, but you might also have your God. And so
Mhm.
that's sort of the mid ground between complex polytheisms and monotheisms. And pure monotheisms are like, this is the one God. This is the one who's in charge of this whole rulial space. They are in charge of the whole thing. It's ultra connected. It has massive levels of abstraction in it. And and effectively for the observer has the utility of saying, I can point anywhere in this space top down. If I focus on this thing when I pray or when I do ritual practice, I will point myself and I will focus on these possible changes because they have utility for me to do something that my religion says to do. Over the course of sort of hundreds of years, and I mean hundreds, so can, these monotheisms matured. And how did they mature? There were philosophical developments within all of them, in Christianity and Islam and Judaism, but also in the Eastern traditions, in Hinduism and in Taoism. They all developed the same way. And they effectively abstracted this sort of monotheistic God whether it's like Hashem or Christ, to something bigger. So something permanent or something you couldn't say very much about. And in Judaism, that's called Ein Sof. In the Tao, it's called the Tao, right? The thing you can't say something about, you can't ascribe it qualities. And what does that sort of
Right. It
speak
was
to in the
ineffable,
Ruliad?
right? Taoism is like
Ineffability.
you can't
Yeah,
to
it's
talk about it is bastardize it, to
to
belittle it.
talk about shrink it is to shrink its causal influence.
Hmm.
And what does that sort of akin to? It's akin to sort of this hyper-computational ground, Stephen's towers of hyper-Ruliads that he talks about sometimes when it's late at night and he's feeling fruity. And that is like the hyper-computational ground. It's the piece that you can't say anything about at all. It's the thing that everything comes from, but is totally, as you said, ineffable. And the key point is each level sort of integrates and transcends the prior in terms of its potential computational power. And what does that do? Well, observers who focus on these gods, they're looking at accessing as much of this real possibility space as they possibly can. Like they want to get the biggest amount of RO that they can get. Animism gives you very little. Mature monotheisms give you the whole shebang. And so these set top-down limits for observers as to what's possible within their observable Ruliad, the part of their Ruliad that they can get to.
I like how the progression of like humans from like small tribes hunter and gathering to having agriculture and settlements, and then those settlements get larger to like nation states and then full on nations, and then you have sort of the religions sort of keeping up with those hierarchies, getting bigger and bigger, and like there's a bigger top to all these.
So this is the thing. It might you see, so in the paper, in the long form paper, there's a section on human superstructure evolution in the appendix
Uh-huh.
that talks about this. And the question is, which one drives which, right? Now, my view is that the religion probably drives the structure because what is the function of religions? They coordinate lots and lots of observers to point in a certain way. So if they're setting the ultimate bound of that sort of observable Ruliad, the superstructures are like bottom-up designed to effectively fill in that space. So they're mechanisms to coordinate lots of observers to populate that space as quickly as possible. And that's one of the core things. Now, that's something that I don't think that's speculative, right? Like, I don't think that's a provable thing. But my guess is that religion leads the other things because it sets the limit. And like that's how science came up, right? Science was a bottom-up thing to show
Hmm.
religion. In same with, how kingships evolved, right? How states evolved, right? First, it was, the leader of a tribe, then it was the king, then it was the king with a divine mandate, but that wasn't big enough. So we got to nation states, we got to integrate. And you can work through these arguments. In fact, the paper does it in a fair amount of detail. You could probably do a lot more detail on the
Right. It's like
argument, but the paper is very
a god is a king that has more continuity than a single human. So it's like,
correct. So you keep it's persistent through time, right? So it has a persistence to it that means that the bound of your sort of observable Riyadh is massive and doesn't change, it doesn't collapse. And you often don't find like in the time between complex polytheisms and sort of axial age monotheisms, you did have emergence of some polytheisms afterwards, right? But they didn't survive because effectively they weren't as evolutionarily fit for observers as the monotheisms. So that's why the sort of large, and by large I mean the major persistent religions or sort of religious structures in the world today all get to an infinite ground, like all get to this ineffable infinite ground. And it exists in the three core monotheisms, in Hinduism, in Taoism. And to me, those are sort of the five major ones that are persistent through time that cover, the large majority of people in the world, right? Like that believe in religion or that even are influenced by religion. So
yeah. Ellen is asking. Ellen, do you want to chime in here with your question, or if you're busy on off camera, I can ask it.
Yeah, I can ask. I was wondering if the different levels on the previous slide where you were talking about how these different levels sort of map onto the religions, the evolution of these sort of levels of power kind of maps onto computational abstraction levels. And I think is very compelling. And I mean, maybe I'm asking the unanswerable question, but I wonder whether the differences are around access to different processes, or if they have like different privileges in some sense, or what are the key distinctions from one level to the next, and where do those distinctions kind of come from?
I mean, that's a hard question, I guess. When you look at sort of how particularly the monotheisms emerged, right? And there's been tons of literature on this, but normally, you look at like something like the Near Eastern or sort of the Canaanite sort of religions. There was that I think, Judaism can be said to have evolved from, even though it's given in a one shot by, in the Torah, it's given one shot by Abraham. There was a Canaanite pantheon that had this sort of one god at the top called El. And then there were lots of sub-gods. So I think 70 or so sub-gods. And effectively that was integrated by Abraham into this single overall deity. But how did he get that? Well, all of the sort of leads of the major monotheisms all had sort of divine mandate, divine prophecy, right? Like they spoke to God, or God spoke in their head, and they were like, this is how it actually is. Now, with a sort of monotheistic deity, you don't have like a real person, it's not like a man standing there telling you, no, this is it. It's really it's like a voice in the head. And that voice in the head, if it's deemed true or deemed useful, is adopted because it adopts positive rules that enhance that observer's, lowers that observer's boundedness, increases the size of its accessible state space, increases its potential persistence, is more evolutionarily fit than the prior. And because in this paper, what we talk about is, well, do observers have a universal telos? And this paper proposes that telos is totally universal and is across observers of all classes. And that telos is to sort of populate or fill Ruliad space, to construct structure in Ruliad space, to observe as much of it as possible to the limit of their observational capacity. And that's taking it from, the minimal observer all the way to us. We just have many more tools to access many more layers of computation than, say, a single cell organism or a molecule, or we just have much more access to it because of the way our brains work and the level of computation we can do comparatively. Hopefully that was an okay answer. That's a hard question.
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks. I knew it was a hard question.
We have some more questions from chat here. Chat's been blowing up. Elandro is asking, how is computation neutral and not a third perspective?
I'm saying neutral in comparison to the core arguments. Like you can frame all of the atheist and theistic arguments in the language of computation. So maybe it is a third pillar, but it's a pillar that incorporates the others. So it's not like they're nested within it, as opposed to being separate. If you can describe an atheistic argument or theistic argument, you can translate that language to computational language. Does that make sense? It's a bigger, as everyone at the Wolfram Physics Project knows, it's a bigger possibility space than the axiomatic math system we use, or the system of logic we use. It incorporates any possible system of logic.
Right. Any possible
it's like
system
the nesting object.
Right.
Yeah.
Of the Ruliad. So yeah, all possible systems of logic / everything that can be described, because you have to describe stuff using a logical framework. So it's like anything describable almost.
Yeah, I guess it comes back to like, what is, as a human, what's our ultimate limit in how we can explain things, right? We can only explain things in cause and effect sequences, right? I think computationally is how it is our hard limit, even though we clearly observe things in QM that have superposition and all the funky stuff that makes lots of physicists pull their hair out. We always describe that process in cause and effect. We always describe it in cause and effect. Even when we describe a superposition, we have to construct the sentence as these particle A and particle B are in superposition. That's a cause and effect sequence. So the hard limit of our observable capacity, at least right now, is that we must describe things in cause and effect, and therefore the Ruliad as the sort of limit structure for describing things of cause and effect means that you can nest any subordinate domain within it. It's like a meta model as opposed to a model, I suppose. That's I like that language, and that's language that sort of Hatem gave me. I think that's quite a nice way of framing it.
Right. Alondra also asks, is God the Ruliad, or is God inside the Ruliad?
No, God is not the Ruliad.
Yeah.
For sure. I have to make this quite clear later. It's an object, it's the biggest possible object through which we can model it. Right? We can model effectively, and we do in this paper, this is what we do. Like I literally take from this ineffable, hyper-computational, I can't say anything about it ground, and then I model it. I go through cause and effect steps to model it. So no, God isn't the Ruliad, and it's in the sort of mature monotheisms, it's ineffable, it's without end, it's not describable, it's beyond concept, beyond cause and effect, etc., etc. That is the sort of mature monotheistic and also Hindu, Vedic, and also Taoist way of describing the ultimate ground. But we'll work through the paper, and you'll hopefully see how we use the Ruliad to construct this thing.
One more comment. Oliver Senchal.
Brother.
Your brother's asking, so do I exist or not?
Yeah, you exist.
There we have it.
That's
Oliver,
not my brother's not getting a long form answer because I think he's doing it to troll me.
Of course.
So
that's how we know he
wanna
exists, because he's trolling you.
Yeah, that's how I know he exists, at least. So we're going to just look at a bit of a summary of some common emanation models. Now, I've used Judaism, but you could equally do something like this with Christianity and with Islam. I just don't know them as well. So you will see that these all look slightly similar. There are nuanced differences across each of them, but effectively you start with an ultimate reality, a limitless void, something without end that you can't say very much about. Then something happens that gives space for creation. So in Hinduism, Maya, it's like the cover of illusion but it doesn't really mean illusion. It means like creative potential. In Kabbalah, it's called Simsum, which is like a contraction, i.e., making space for multiplicity. We then get sort of a concept of, in Judaism and Hinduism, some meta observer or personal God. We then get from the Sephirot, Jiva, 5 elements, categories of things we can sample. And then we get worlds, domains in which we sample those categories. And then at the very bottom, we get physical reality. I think there are lots of words on here that will mean very little to a lot of the smart science people here. But I think if we look at the common structures, you start with an ineffable infinite source, beyond computation, unobservable to bounded observers. You get some differentiation, which here looks like symmetry breaking, because if you have some perfect infinite thing, imagine you could for a second rotate it or fit it in your brain. From every which way it would look the same. So you have some symmetry breaking, i.e., it's less perfect than it once was to make the world. You have hierarchical emanation. So from less rule bounded categories to more rule bounded categories, i.e., the more constraints, the more rules you have in a category, the lower down in cardinality it is. And then you have multiple domains or multiple levels and worlds, and they're distinct domains of computation with different levels of causal coverage. And then you get physical reality, which is the most rule constrained domain. There have to be a lot of rules being run for the observer to get a persistent sampling, and those rules must be run. They can't be avoided. And that for us might be, I have to breathe air, I have to, go to sleep, otherwise I die. All of those things are persistent rules that, in sort of more abstract domains, let's look at sort of symbolic logic, you don't need those rules, right? You don't need to sleep in the world of symbols. I mean, LLMs don't need to sleep, they just need the power on. That gives you a sense as to the delta. I think each tradition maps these differently, i.e. they either set different category constructions or different slices or different domains or different worlds, but the topology is sort of weakly equivalent or isomorphic. You can basically cut this pie any number of ways, but they're all doing the same sort of cuts, even if they do slightly more or slightly less. And this is a flow from sort of infinite simple oneness at the very top, Ein Sof, Brahman, Wuji, to multiplicity through constraint cascades. And this is a very famous theological argument. It's the argument of negation. It's been used in every major tradition in the monotheisms, but they all talk about what can you say about God? Well, you can't say about anything about it. You can only say what it isn't. And that's sort of that idea playing all the way through this. Each time you get a constraint, you get a new rule. So now we'll move on to the conjecture. So here I want to just start by, I'm focusing now on Judaic or Kabbalistic cosmogenesis. What that means is how does Kabbalah say the world was created? How does it actually say not just the pure sort of lines in Genesis, the first 7 days, but what the reads of those first 7 days are through the tradition, through the philosophical work on those books. Now, I want to set out sort of a few definitions first, and then I'll talk about the axioms. So I've got Kabbalistic definitions on the left, computational in the middle, and plain English on the right, just because I think this is going to be introducing a lot of new words. So when I talk about Ein Sof, what I mean computationally is the state before the Ruliad, this hyper-Ruliad, if you're, the tower of hyper-Ruliads, if you're in sort of Stephen's land. But it's really the infinite before anything distinct exists. It would be the thing capping that hyper-Ruliad. It would be the thing containing every possible construction, the total ineffable thing. Simsum is like a not operator. It's like the first no, this doesn't contain that thing that makes identity as a function meaningful. So when you have category construction, every single category you have in category theory has a little identity line going back to itself. This is the point where you can get that. Then you have something called halal panui, which is the space within this simsum, this construction. So the space within this Ein Sof that forms the boundary of the Ruliad, like the limit line of the Ruliad. Imagine it as like a two-dimensional circle. It's the line of the circle with nothing in it. Then we have something called the Kav, which is like a faucet of how much of that infinite information flows into that empty space. And it's like a rate limited information channel, right? Because if you have something infinite, and that should just collapse back to the infinite straight away, right? Logically, if you have something infinite and it's creating something finite, if there's no bound on how much of that information is coming into that space, whether you've allowed something finite to be, it will just collapse. It will just go back to the infinite state because that infinite state is perfect in equilibrium. It is a natural state. So this is like a rate limiter, turning the tap down so that we only fill the bath just as fast as the bath can take water. Then we have something called Adam Kadmon in Kabbalah. This is what our meta observer is. This is in rule from physics language. This is like what I would call a maximally entangled observer. And thankfully, a few weeks before this presentation, Memes of Destruction did an amazing talk about defining the units of this meta observer, which was very helpful for thinking about this. So thank you very much. And this thing in plain English is like the operating system. It determines what the limit of what objects can exist and how they can exist. Then you have something called Sephirot. These are like categories of observables. So infinite categories of all of possible observables. In Kabbalah, there are 10. And these all have more rule constraints. So they're all like nested like a triangle. And you'll see that on the next few pages. But they have filters or more, each one has progressively more rules, removing more possible objects from that. So every time you add a rule, that category gets smaller informationally because it has to exclude something. Then you have something called Shevarat Hakelim, which in English means breaking of the vessels. The steps in this process, as we'll get to, are you build the categories first, and those categories are complete because you have infinite computational power. And then they have a symmetry breaking event, which breaks the categories because some of the categories can't compute all of that. And then you can get to individual elements or objects within those categories. And then you have something called parts of FIM. They're what are computational networks, and they're like distributed or parallel processing to handle the information afterwards. So you can start to build the objects to fill those categories back up. And then 4 worlds here is what we talked about on the prior page. They're hierarchical computational domains from sort of pure abstraction, which would be, the shape of the circle before you have the formula, down to symbolic logic, down to valuational logic, down to physical reality. And those give you sort of the words we'll be playing with in this conjecture. And then the axioms that set this up are any classical sentence about Ein Sof, the big pre-Ruliad object, is not evaluatable as true or false for observers like us. Then the second axiom is there exists a map of regimes, this Simpson, this knob operator, that carries boundary level expressions into a classical arena where logic and information measures can be used. So effectively, these 2 axioms mean that I can now use logic. I can now use information theory. I can now use a bunch of tools. And then the third one relates to the CAV, or the rate limited info channel. Admitted information into the domain, into that created domain, is capacity bounded over a finite horizon, i.e. it doesn't immediately collapse. And then axiom 4, observers exist in that created regime whose evaluations are admissible, i.e. a meta observer or eventually us. And those observers have standard sort of category-theoretic things, like they're admissible, they don't die, etc. And there's a long list of sort of, I think, 8 core properties of observers that you can go through in the paper that will sort of work through exactly what those observers look like from the axiomatic perspective. I've also given some more computational translations for just more general computational theological ideas to kind of give people more of a feeling for what we're talking about when we talk about theology in the Ruliad. I think the important ones are, like, for observers, like divine will, search function, optimization algorithm. Creation is path actualization by a meta observer, choosing which computational rule to run from all possible rules. Some of the others, right, that I quite like are, like when you think of a soul, it's like your individual observer function, or your specific ultra filter for reducing that information down to something you can sort of grok and pass. And it's your unique perspective and selection criteria. And then, something like a miracle, lawful but extremely unlikely event. So in the Ruliad, but might be 0.0 going on for a very long time, 1% probability, but that would be still admissible as in computational theology. I'm going to work through the first step now, and here what I've done is just forget looking at the right-hand side with the key functions, because that I'll talk through in a second. So on the left-hand side of the 3 diagrams is sort of how sort of Judaic cosmogenesis walks through this space. The middle column is, running and basically a Turing machine style abstraction, where these Turing machines are outputting categories. They're not outputting objects, right? They're just outputting fully complete categories. And then on the far right, I'm looking at how that would create sort of something like geometry within an unsampled Ruliad. So if I've got, the Ruliad is there, then we get sort of a meta observer that can do a computation over the entire Ruliad in one go. What does that foliation or slice create when it makes that reading? So I'll work through this sort of one by one. So state 0, we have this ineffable thing. It makes a space for other stuff, and that's that white space in the middle. It's known as the vacated space in English. And then you have a little tiny channel that flows in sort of this information from this infinite thing. Then you get a meta observer. This dotted line the blue line on the left in state 1 in step 1.2, 1.3 is the meta observer called Adam Kadmon in Kabbalah. Looking at that from a Turing machine perspective, we're now inside this sort of ineffable infinite thing. At state 0, we have an input. That input is the category of all possible causes. We have a rule. Output the next largest informational category. Sorry, my light's just turned off. And that here is the category of effects. So it's everything not containing the first cause. Apologies, give me 1 second, Dugan. Apologies.
For sure, yeah. All right. You're well lit.
There you go. Sorry. Yeah,
no problem.
Apologies. So what is the category of all possible causes and the category of effects? So the category of all possible effects is basically every possible thing except for the first cause. And that rule is very simple, right? So I'm defining this rule as just the next largest informational category. It just deletes one possible object or one possible category of objects. And on the right-hand side, when we look at that sort of topologically, what's that doing? We have an unsampled Ruliad at the top. It's unobserved. The meta observer slices this raw Ruliad into two categories, a category of causes and a category of effects. And this gives you a sort of one-dimensional vector. So imagine this infinite groupoid, it's suddenly let's imagine it as a 3D sphere, it's suddenly sliced in half.
Mm-hmm.
And so we now have a one-dimensional line that's going through that, and that's the first sort of symmetry breaking event within this structure. And then over here on the right-hand side, we look at sort of functions. So the top half basically says it uses the Verne-Turney language to say, I have some ambient topos that can do anything, basically. And then I'm going to define this function Simpson, which then gives me a Boolean, a topos below it that's a Boolean topos where I can do logic. And that gives me the ability to count things like morphisms, like a bunch of things that you need in category theory to effectively construct a Ruliad. And this not leads to sort of the concepts of presence and absence, of fullness and emptiness, of infinity and finitude, and a computational 1 and 0, a binary. So you get from this binary. Now, the expression for the cav is basically, there are a few constructions you could possibly use, but it basically says, provide the maximum amount of information into this space such that the space doesn't collapse. That is what that function says. And then the definition of Adam Kadmon, the meta observer, it says the category of effects, X is an element of the Ruliad and C causes X. And then we define that as the morphisms, the functors, the rules, etc., etc., etc. And so this category of effects is equivalent to the full Ruliad here. Are there any questions? Because that was quite a lot and I'm covering it quite fast because I'm conscious of...
Yeah, so, if the Ein Sof is sort of the ineffable everything, or the undefined, and then you start, going back 2 slides, I guess, you start to define something, just start like, we're going to talk about this, we're going to define this, I'm going to think about this, or I'm going to absorb this, and you're like excluding everything that isn't inside that circle. And
that's a good heuristic. Yeah, that's a good heuristic for it. And so really, in the paper, what I do is I construct this axiom, so this Simpson axiom, in 2 ways. I do it in the sort of topological way, but I also do it in paraconsistent logic as well.
Mm-hmm.
So this is like a Graham Priest thing that he's done before. I guess the point here is to do this, I'm not, apart from the axioms that I've stated, I'm not using anything that's invented. I'm using stuff that's already used in academia in lots of different ways, and I'm really just applying it to the Ruliad. I guess when I look at, if we look at like something like, if we look at sort of Adam Kadmon and we look at sort of at the bottom category of effects, O, M, R, F, what are those things? So O is all set of all possible objects or elements. M is set of all possible morphisms. R is the composition rules for those morphisms, and F is the functorial relationships that preserve the mapping structure between them. So we're building up this category effect so that it's like, okay, this is the full Ruliad. This is like the full thing. And how do we get down from that now? And so this is when I talk about bottom up and top down. When you guys are doing, I'm finding the rule for, general relativity.
Mhm.
I'm going, how do I get from the categories of rules down to individual rules with a bit of lossiness?
Right. There's a choosing of a definition to start with.
Correct. Yeah, correct. But then that choice exists bottom up as well. When you choose an axiom system for, for physics, or you say this is the structure of the space, that's a choice to effectively, these are all choices to save bounded computational power that you have as an observer. And so these choices are always prejudiced, always got some prejudice. And whilst most scientists will probably be upset at me for saying this, like, I think axioms are like scientific beliefs, even though they're like, they're like scientific beliefs to me. They kind of like, I will have this belief until I can get a better belief that covers more. And that might be
I really
unfair, and
like
that
that.
might be a bit unfair, but I kind of, I think they kind of share that same DNA. As we work through the second step is construction of the sort of biggest categories. So when they're drawn out in sort of religious textbooks, you see the left-hand side, they draw these circles, these ever decreasing circles, and they give these categories names. So you have Adam Kadmon, then you have something called Keter, then you have Chokhmah, then you have Bina. In the middle column, I give them sort of the plain English definition. So we have, building on the first page, state 0, category of causes. State 1 gives us a category of effects. We have another not rule running, so make the next biggest categories. We get category of sameness, which is Chokhmah, and category of difference, which is Bina. And then a category falls out from those called the category of relationships between those things. So you start to join up those lines, you get branchial computation. And these rules are the same rule between state 0 and state 1, and state 1 and state 2, and in state 3 it's compute between existing categories subject to rule 1. So these rules are still quite simple, but they're still outputting very large categories. And then if you look at the function, what are these Sephirot, what are these categories? So it's saying these Sephirot are sequential. The Sephirot have restrictions, more rule restrictions, and the ones that have more possible morphisms. There are more possible morphisms in CM in the next lower category than there are in the category above it, because there are more possible choices because you're excluding less things, so you give them more choices. These 10 Sephirot, these 10 categories eventually form a sequential causal graph, with each subsequent categorical output possessing less accessible states than its predecessor. When we look at that topologically, we start with cause and effect. We have the 1D, one-dimensional line, the vector. State 2 is effectively measures between those. So we take relative computational distance of those causal chains, i.e. sameness and difference. So if you look at the state 2 circle, you'll see I've got a couple of causes and a couple of effects, and you get distance from that. Now, there's a mathematician called Lucy Spounder, who I think is associated with Levin's lab, who's building maths from doing these negations and building dimensionality from set theory in exactly this method. In fact, there's a paper or a talk on his YouTube channel probably a few weeks ago that it in fact does this. So state 2, you can see that in sort of more detail with much more robust mathematical background than I have.
Who'd you say that
Working
was?
through that.
I'll have to
Lucy
look him up.
Spounder, Spounder. But she's done something like state 2 when she talks about how to construct math from set theory, how to construct numbers. And she works sort of top down as well by negation. Then we get to state 3. So state 3, because we now have relationship between those, we can produce synthetic 2D geometry, right? So we now get a second line in the Ruliad. So we don't just have the difference in sameness on that same 1D line, like points on a 1D line and different size, we now get the relationship. So we now get a 2D structure within the Ruliad. There are two observable dimensions for our meta observer, cause and effect, and sameness and difference, sometimes termed thesis and antithesis in philosophy, where the middle point at infinity is synthesis, where those things cancel each other out. And those two dimensions that meta observer samples is the element a cause or an effect? And how close computationally are those causes and effects? So that gives you the two sampleable dimensions of information that meta observer now has access to through those foliations. The third step is long, but effectively what I've spelled out here is on the left-hand side, we have how those categories are constructed. They're constructed in size order, so smaller informational categories are lower down, you get the 10, and they're not organized into a parallelization system. The more interesting thing is the right-hand side of that big diagram, where you have geometry and topology in the observable Ruliad. So we've got to state 3 where we have 2 dimensions, and then the subcategories effectively output a 3-dimensional space and a 4-dimensional space. So we get 4 dimensions and then a 5th dimension at the very end. And Kabbalistic cosmogenesis is why I was so interested in the sort of maximally entangled observer talk you did. Is Kabbalistic cosmogenesis says that the ultrafilter the meta observer uses to pass this infinite information is a 5-dimensional hypercube. It's a concept that was written about by a physicist who was also a rabbi called Aryeh Kaplan sometime in the 80s, but he didn't have computational language to work through anything with, and you get sort of 5 dimensions where you have 3 spatial dimensions that can now be sampled, 1 dimension of time, and 1 dimension of information that can be cut up in any number of ways. So the most computationally efficient way to cut up that informational dimension is once, because you can effectively fit everything in there. But other religious traditions do it in lots of ways. So Hinduism has 25, right? They have 25 tattvas. Taoism has, like, I think 10,000 things. You get different, this is where you start to get bifurcation in how the religions look at how these constructions work. And then on the right-hand side, I talk about those categories. So in the observer theory paper, the extension paper, I set out an anthropomorphic sort of observable domain set that was based on our own cognitive layers. And I've applied that to just what we get from Kabbalah. So at the top, we have something called Keter, which its translation is sort of will or willpower. The observer theory domain is like the minimal constraint domain, i.e. cause-effect structure. It has less rules because more objects are admissible to that structure than lower down. It is the most informationally dense. So every cause and every possible effect as a category must cover all the subcategories. It must have more causal influence. If I look at that category of causes and category of effects and put them together, every subordinate category and every subordinate object must be a part of that thing. Therefore, that causal coverage is very high. And you see on the right-hand side, I won't run through all of these, but as we work down, you go from Keter, will, to Chokhmah, abstract thought, to Bina, which is like linguistic thought, so that's symbolic. You go to a new domain, and you can see on the computational function of these, the will is like the optimal search function. Abstract thought is like pure undifferentiated computational potential. Bina or linguistic thought or symbolic thought is like structural organization that enables you to discretize it. And then you have a valuational domain that has six categories in it. One that deals with expansion, one that deals with restriction, one that balances between them, one that deals with persistence through time, one that deals with pattern replication, and one that's the interface between this ingression from Platonic space, this sort of informational space, to the physical space, to physical reality. And so when, at the moment, there's a lot of work being done by Levin's lab on Platonic space, these models for how Platonic space ingress into physical reality have existed for hundreds and hundreds of years in every tradition. So the fact that science is now sort of rolling and coming back to it now, I find it quite interesting that these things are happening at the time when we have a language like computation to enable this to be specified, probably better than I will specify it in this talk, but can be specified in a lot of detail. And there are lots of models for how this happens. So if scientists wanted to look at those things for ideas or inspiration, they would find very, very robust models. And this doesn't just apply to religions, right? It applies to sort of Greek philosophy, Plato and the Demiurge and the Logos. You can get it from a lot of different places, but they're all talking about that. And so here you moving from really informationally dense portions of the Ruliad to really sparse informational parts of it. And so those things work in opposition. If you have less rules, you have more information. If you have more rules, you have less information in the output. And that's sort of the way that's the way we think about like categories in this build up. So the fourth step is categories to objects. So when those categories are computed, they are fully complete, right? We have infinite computational power. They are full and done. So that doesn't allow for individual objects because those categories are complete objects. So what happens is the information coming in from that ineffable thing at the top breaks the lower structures. It effectively the information going in exceeds the processing capacity of that category. So it doesn't compute all of the possible objects. There are too many objects being pumped into it, and it breaks. This is called the shattering of the vessels in Kabbalah, but effectively enables object or element multiplicity within a category, and that enables everything else, right? So it enables the physical world, enables us, enables stuff. Once that shattering happens, it's akin to symmetry breaking within those categories that are fully computed and fully complete. We then have network structure. So after that happens, these categories are sort of reorganized or made into an ultrafilter that enables parallelization of the computation, and that decreases the computational boundedness of those lower categories that have shattered, and therefore they can now compute things to basically fill back up again with objects. In Kabbalah, this is recursive, so effectively this information flows round and around this ultrafilter, or this ultrafilter has sort of a light going, imagine infinite light going into an ultrafilter, and it bounces around the ultrafilter as much as it wants, but it doesn't crack the ultrafilter, and then you get objects being outputted. It's kind of holographic in conception, and that's sort of how they talk about it. But what it generates is things like feedback loops, oscillatory patterns, and computational attractors, right? So that is what this network of parallelization of these computational objects does in Kabbalistic cosmogenesis that enables the world to be built. And then we get sort of the full creation process, and this is probably the cleanest version of this diagram. So this work is just showing you all of those steps and showing you the output of that. So when you see things like the tree of life in Kabbalah, or you see other sort of the flower, I can't remember what the flower was called, but the flower in Hinduism, these are all versions of sort of very lossy expressions of what these ultrafilters are for each tradition that are doing this filtering. And so you can see here that this defines all of the last steps we've worked through. But I think at this point, because I've run through that very fast, I'm conscious I've been talking for an hour and a half already, and I've barely got out of this section. If there are any questions on this, then please feel free to ask, because I've run through this really quick.
Yeah, it's a lot. It certainly is a lot. But I do like the idea of filtering down and having narrower filters, definitions of things.
Look, I think what I'm trying to do here is show that there's a correspondence or a consilience with the ideas of, i.e. these mappings are not trivial. Like, they're not trivial mappings. Like, they in theory work with the mathematical formalism of the Ruliad, such that they are conciliant, even if you disagree with the premise that there's this infinite thing at the top. Like you can construct categories like this in the Ruliad if you have a maximally entangled observer that has all of the computational power in the in the Ruliad. Now that is a big assumption, but it's an assumption that every major religion makes. And so it's weird that that comes out of every tradition across traditions that didn't communicate when they were coming up with this stuff, which I find to be spooky. But I think it's really interesting that you can even do this and that it even has any ability to work at all. But now I just want to look at sort of these domains because I think this will sort of bring you a bit more clarity. So Kabbalah structures observational domains into 4 layers under the meta observer, each with different levels of rule constraint. Hinduism has more, Buddhism has more, Taoism has the same. So this is done across all those traditions. The Kabbalistic world and the observer theory domain that I map it to and the computational analogy are pretty straightforward. Absolute is minimally constrained. It's like abstract structure, logic, math predicates. Berea is symbolic. It's the world of algorithms. Yetzirah is the valuational domain. It's like configured data structures. And Asiya is the physical domain. It's like running the program on the hardware. And you can see here that the information density across the domains goes down from infinite to close to approaching 0. The number of rules per domain is high for Asiya, none for Ein Sof, and an accessibility to observers like us, i.e. how much of that space we're able to sample, high for physical world, low to none for the very top, right? So we don't get full sampling of these bigger spaces because of our boundedness. And these are different layers in the Ruliad that we have access to, or our observational apparatus has access to. So just using observers like us as an example, I access, physical world. I can pick up this pen. I access evaluational world. I have an emotional framework where I can access potentially more emotional states than I can access physical states because there's infinite variation between all of my emotional states, and I have direct experience of them. Symbolic states I have sort of a bit less access to, and then the metaphysical state I have less access to, and that's bounded by my working memory and by my active memory.
Which are in turn physical constraints.
And my physical constraints. So the physical constraints at the bottom bind everything, right? And so, but the fact that we can these are sort of heuristics based on what observers like us can access. But in the original observer theory extension, I'm using them here as a correspondence, but really that structure can be cut up by a researcher any way you want. It's just you have to find my view is there has to be multi-domain information integration for us to have experience. And what's quite interesting is recently IIT have run experiments that are experimentally confirmed multi-domain or multi-level information integration in the brain when having conscious experience. They actually confirm 4 layers. So that was September, that was 2 months ago. So there are things that came out recently that have provided at least early support to this type of domain decomposition, even if they're not using quite the same words. And then just to give you some of the comparative synthesis to say this isn't just a single religion's framework, you can look at Kabbalah, Judaism, Hinduism, and Taoism. You get infinite source, binary distinction, levels, what the physical domain is called, the information gradient, i.e. from more informationally dense to less, and the return path, i.e. what this observer is doing. So in Judaism, it's called tikkun olam. It's like reconstructing the space, reconstructing these categories that broke. In Hinduism, it's called moksha. In Taoism, it's called returning to Tao. So this is all practices, all things you have to do to reconstruct that space. And they might be telling you to do different things, but structurally, they're common. So to bring that all together, what are religions in this framework? They can be viewed as evolutionary algorithms. They help human observers explore ever larger computational maps of reality. Each tradition encodes strategies for finding more structure and information. And over time, belief systems have extracted upwards. Each step gives us access to a bigger computational possibility space, i.e. more of the Ruliad. This parallels science progression. So we go from heuristics to classical laws to quantum mechanics, and I've got information theory on the right because I'm clearly quite into computational ways of thinking. So that would be for me the next step. But I think each level transcends and includes the prior, collectively expanding what we know. And so religions are like the top-down way of discovering that algorithm. And I think science is moving the same way and is just approaching it bottom up. And why is science successful? It has more ability to make truth claims, or more closer to truth claims than religion, at least in the narrow domains they can test for, which means that you lose as an observer. You effectively push that into, computationally predictable, i.e. I don't need to use as much computation to figure that out anymore. That's really helpful here, and we'll come on to why in the next part. Insights. So what is this model useful for, right? So if we use this model of, computational theology, we have a lot of weird and hard questions that suddenly become quite straightforward when you put it into sort of a Ruliad framework. Do we need observation measurement for reality? This implies observation is fundamental. Yes, like we need it. And that's also been shown in some experiments in physics recently where they've constructed closed universes that they expected to have sort of infinite dimensional Hamiltonians that only had one, and they couldn't figure out why. And they're now putting observers into those closed universe simulations, and suddenly they're getting more dimensions. That gives you one example of how that seems to be aligning with physics. How does infinite create finite? We have a bounded meta-observer filtering the infinite to the finite. What does that imply? It implies some form of universal telos, i.e. the purpose of an observer is to integrate information about the topos, like a sub-agent reconstructing a knowledge graph. Is free will ontologically real? Yes, because even though we're in a deterministic structure, the observer is subject to computational irreducibility. So it's compatibilist because we never have a view from nowhere. We never have that deterministic view in full. We only have the computationally irreducible view. So why evil? If God's perfect, why do you get evil? Computational irreducibility for bounded observers. Observers can't perfectly predict their outcomes. Their field of observation is not their full observable Ruliad. Therefore, they make suboptimal optimization choices in the choices they make between states. Is meaning ontologically real? In a Ruliad containing every possible choice, why does stuff matter? Because observers get to choose. Observers like us get lots of choices. Lower complexity observers get fewer choices. So a couple of things. Why does an infinite ground not make claims equivalent? I think any system that tries to explain sort of everything leans on axioms, logic, induction, but it doesn't make frameworks equal. We've got some distinctions here. Unprovable cannot be finally derived from a more basic system. Unequal can differ dramatically in coherence, explanatory power, and usefulness. On the right, I look at materialism and theism and compare it to this conjecture. I go, what does materialism give us? It gives us explanatory power in the sciences. Theism gives us explanatory power for why questions. The God conjecture, by effectively melding them in a computational model, should give you both. The gaps are why questions for materialism. For theism, it's everything else. And for this, I don't know yet. I don't know what the gaps are because this is pretty brand new. What are there predictions? Materialism, yes, testable. Traditional theism, no. But this makes predictions that are testable. So the God conjecture does make predictions that are testable. Parsimony. Materialism has multiple frameworks. Theism is a yes, but. And God conjecture is single framework with others as subsystems, but requires the Ruliad. So if the Ruliad is shown as not real, or not a computation is somehow not needed in this fashion, then this falls apart, right? So this is really pinning the mask to the fact that this abstraction is ontologically useful and real and epistemologically useful. And then coherence. So you have paradoxes in materialism at domain boundaries. disagrees with material evidence in theism, and here we don't get those contradictions because of this computational model. And we're effectively taking the Ruliad saying, here's the Ruliad for physics, but can we create maps to other things within it? And so it should resolve paradoxes. And I think the question I'm trying to answer is not, is this provable? Because clearly this conjecture is not provable given the axioms. But does it give us more understanding for fewer assumptions? I think that answer leans towards yes. And it doesn't stop, people like you going bottom up and building out, black hole physics from the discrete Ruliad. And I think that's why it's quite neat. So this page is empirical support predictions and falsification criteria. I'll run through this pretty fast. Some of these came out in the last few weeks, but multi-scale information integration, the test, the test design, they've already done it. If conscious states do not show this, then this domain alignment is wrong. But the empirical hints have started on that already. Telos in all observer systems is another. If we have telos, we should see information integration seeking behavior, and goal direction should be seen in non-life systems. And in fact, Michael Levin's work is demonstrating this all the time. He's even doing it with sorting algorithms. So total non-life, they are showing goal direction. Xenobots and other things showing goal direction. Here's where we go to something more religious focused. What does mystical experience correspond to in the God Conjecture? Sampling from less constrained domains that reflect lower self-boundary and increased global integration. And you could do cross-tradition neural imaging of contemplative practices across Buddhism, Christianity, Sufism, and you should see convergent neuro patterns for each system, for each system's meditative or contemplative practice, irrespective of the differences and of what they focus on. And you should see that, you see hints in that from studies of Buddhist meditators, but they haven't done sort of cross religion tests yet. But in Buddhist meditators, they see DMN suppression, whole brain integration going up in sort of peer-reviewed experiments. The next to impact of prayer, we have sort of collective focus questions. Now there's a project called the Global Consciousness Project, which does measurements on this, but it's pretty controversial. But the idea would be that you rigorously predict small but reproducible deviations in high intensity collective focus. There's a Dean Randin study that's a meta-analysis that shows this randomly around statistically significant effects around major events, but it's not been sort of formalized and tested in a very good way. But you could test this I guess you could test this under this framework. And then you have, consciousness and quantum properties. Now, conscious states should interact with quantum systems in a way that can't be reduced to classical noise. And you can track this by comparing decoherence rates in conscious and unconscious tissue and look for entanglement structures. Now, you already have people doing this in ORCOR, like Stuart Hameroff. Now, it's pretty controversial in my view. Just like Stephen says, EAMs are like the building block of the Ruliad, this atom of space. I think ORCOR is like the machine code part of consciousness. It's actually a low order description with not a great deal of higher order explanatory power. But my guess is that under this, it probably looks like the mechanism. And then a couple of points. Does this predict differently? Yes. So it's not just a relabeling and a reclassification. It makes distinctive predictions. So in the Ruliad, you can have many worlds quantum mechanics because you have the branchial structure. You can get every possible universe. But here, what we're saying is observers select branches in a computationally efficient way because it tracks with the telos of integrating information, and you have an infinite power source, so it should go as fast as possible. So we are actually in the most computationally efficient branch of reality, and many worlds is not every. So Dave, effectively what I'm saying is someone much smarter than me is wrong, and not every possible, particle collision produces a new entire history. Branch rates track information integration telos, and it's gradient like. So we are literally searching for the most computationally efficient information gradients to repopulate the space. And then versus Copenhagen interpretation, Collapse is the emergent description of an observer's bounded sampling. There is no ontic collapse, only computational constraint. That is a different way of saying, that is a different thing. And then in materialism, we're saying materialism says consciousness arises, there's no special rule. And what the God Conjecture says is it's a threshold of integrated information across domains, and not all computations qualify. So it's the opposite of materialism. And then idealism, physical world is derivative of mind, it's all mental stuff. And what we're saying here is that mind and matter are perspectival slices of the same computational structure. Information is fundamental, not its instantiation. So these are things that this says that I think are different to several sort of leading ways of interpreting QM or philosophical positions. And so what I wanted to do with this was not just go, here's a translation. I wanted this translation to also say something. And then what this says is, I also looked at this in the context of a research program, because there are things you need, is this fruitful to look at in detail? And I think it behaves like a progressive program. It generates predictions. It unifies domains, even if it's a lossy mapping right now. It suggests experiments, and it provides explicit mathematical structures that both fit with an existing formalism and expand it, possibly badly, but possibly not as great as it could be done. But it's empirically engaged, and it's not just metaphysics. And I think you can look at this as something to work through in that way. And effectively, if this makes predictions, and then it should be useful. And if those predictions are proven false, we should drop it. But that's what I'm trying to do here, is trying to give a language where theists and scientists, or can talk and go, I think this should happen based on this computationally theological model that utilizes a structure that outputs physics. And I think that's fruitful because it joins domains that we've been told for hundreds of years, or maybe 100 years, should stay in their own lane. And I think staying in your own lane limits inquiry, and that's why this is quite exciting for me. I've got a huge amount of stuff to cover, but what are the implications here? I think I'll run through this pretty fast because we've nearly been at 2 hours, and I want to, but the core thing is observers all the way down. I think the three main things we look at are minimal observers and how they grow, symmetries and computation. And I read physical symmetries as constraints on what observers can reliably sample and compress. And I look at the sort of quantum fields as the computational ground in which observers' patterns are carved out. This is it's a reinterpretation, but it's offering a route between hypergraphs, category-theoretic observers, and theological structures. And then I look at things from I look at the following: can an atom be an observer? This is using Xerxes and Hatem's model, and picking out, here's the 5 core things. What does a hydrogen atom
I was just about to say, absorbing photons is an active observation of an atom or an electron. Yeah.
It makes me happy that you're saying that and not me. It makes me much happier when it comes from a physicist and a mathematician's mouth. But the claim here is that trivial observation is not conscious, but it does satisfy the criteria of an observer. And it's the first rung on an observer hierarchy, where the observers are seeking to effectively integrate more information. And for an atom, right, what does that look like? It looks like the black hole limit, a point of infinite information density.
Mm-hmm.
So you do get this in physical space. We do get it with minimal observers. You do get this sort of shape of climbing an information gradient. And it means, why is it important? Well, it means we can talk about observer constraints at every scale of physics. And that, I think, is important when you're trying to build a model up from, okay, we've got this nice top-down picture, but does this top-down picture actually map to the bottom-up picture? And that's kind of at least pretty important for it to be robust. So here we look at symmetries, and this is, I think, physics 101 for most people. But you've got each symmetry produces a conservation law. And really what the point of this page is symmetries in the observer's slice of the Ruliad are conserved quantities in physics. And that means that you're linking symmetries to observer's foliation. And you can see why those foliations that I made and why I did that geometry and topology thing now, because I'm saying it's pretty important for constructing objects for us. And then symmetry breaking here is information explosion. So when we break symmetry, we increase the observer's distinguishable state space. If perfect symmetry gives you one distinguishable state, then breaking it creates many distinct states. So pre the shattering of the vessels, sort of the RO had one equivalence class, and then post, it just grows explosively as more branches in the Ruliad become distinguishable. And you can think of it like a symmetry group and a residual subgroup, and it scales like the coset space of that thing. So that, I think, is a way you can link it to maths and how you link it to set theory and link it to how these symmetry groups grow for observers at any scale. And the analogy I use is a Rubik's Cube, one configuration, perfect symmetry. And then as you get them scrambled, you get up to 10 to 19 configurations because the symmetry has been broken. And then that maps back to the Kabbalistic setting of the Cosmogenesis, symmetry breaking in R, you pick a branch, you get more fine-grained equivalence classes. The breaking of the vessels means that you get that at a lower level in individuated objects. And then the takeaway is that one-to-many is a description in the language of like thousands of years ago, before they had math, before they had physics, before they had this, of how this computation, observation, and symmetry produces structured universes, i.e., how creation happened. You've got to remember that the language that people had back in the day was just a lot less flexible than the language we have. We invent new words, we invent new concepts. And so the way I think about the language of religious texts is that they're compressing an enormous amount of information into as fewer words as they possibly can. And they're telling them through stories because at the time, that's the maximal technology they have to communicate complex information. So it's like, when I look at, a category theoretic construction, it's communicating a lot of information to me in like 5 symbols, but to someone who doesn't know it, it's gibberish. And it's the same way back then. Like that's effectively, it's effectively a reflection of it. And this is what I think is going on. I think that these ideas, because in this space, if humans are in some way connected to God, right? And like that's what religions say, you are connected to this infinite thing, then you have awareness of this sort of single unique morphism from you to this, this infinite thing.
It's relational, yeah.
That's relational. And so it would make sense that these sorts of languages are discovered in different sort of cultural contexts and different languages by every type of person, or every person that sort of has prophecy or has revelation in religious language. They should say roughly the same computational thing. If they don't, then maybe this is wrong. But over time, it seems like, at least in the persistent large religions we have today, when you strip away all of the words and you strip it back to sort of computational logic language, they all say the same thing. Or at least the 5 major ones say the same thing that I've looked at in detail. So that's helpful. Again, quantum fields as computational ground. I think this comes back to some of the work that you guys are looking at in the Wolfram Physics project, so I won't teach you to suck eggs. But physical reality is sort of our bounded computer. I think you've got the processor, you've got clock speed, which you can define from the Wolfram Physics project's fundamental units, memory, i.e. the total maximal information density is the Bekenstein bound, and the network speed is the speed of light as our sort of bounded maximal speed in the observable universe. And the conjecture is that quantum fields are like the physical computational substrate of our universe. Like that's what computation is happening on. And when we slice it in Planck time, or, a bit further up, because we're not that fast, we get to our stuff, because these things are reduced objects with minimal entropy. They are maximally stable. This was fun. I mapped physics concepts to religion, cosmogenesis across these traditions to say, now this has got a lot on it, but it works through sort of the different eras in physical time in the Big Bang. And it says, what do these correspond to in both Genesis and Kabbalah? Genesis applies to Christianity and Islam as well, in Hinduism and in Taoism. And you can look at information transitions, you can look at symmetry breakings, and you can see that these things, again, in a lossy way, correspond or map to physics with a computational lens using both information and symmetry, right? You can't do it without the two columns on the right, but you can work through symmetries from sort of, you can work through this process and go, this again, I go back to 4,000 years ago. Are they are they using intuition to find this stuff? Is it intuiting a pattern that we will discover irrespective? So if you binned all the religions today, would we discover the same sort of religions if would we discover these things from scratch again? And that's the question that is quite hard to answer and that I'm very interested in. Next implication, evolution. So here, I think evolution is informational, because if I have information as a substrate, then evolution is not just physical survival. And I think it's powerful because it's actually surfing pre-existing information gradients. The standard story is that natural selection explains complexity, variation, via variation, inheritance, and survival. But the no free lunch theorem implies that evolution operates on special, highly structured classes of problems, i.e. pre-shaped informational landscapes. What we're saying in the God Conjecture is that evolutionary biology plus an informational layer is the reason why this works, i.e. we have attractors, we have information gradients that we are trying to find and surf. And it only works because this landscape is informationally structured from high density to low density per this cosmogenesis that we've just talked about in the prior section when we had all those categories. So we're going from least to most dense. And because that structure is embedded in the architecture of the universe or the architecture of the Ruliad, we are effectively accessing it. And so that's why evolution isn't just survival, variation, randomness. Though you can't tell either way, right? You can logically prove that you couldn't tell if it was random or if it was designed by the fact that you're stuck inside the system. Again, the Dembski-Marx sort of theorem is information to make search efficient must come from somewhere. Now here, it comes from this infinite thing in this categorical construction. In the physical world, it's fine. That manifests as fine-tuned physics, chemistry, boundary conditions. And
yeah, biologically, you know, the information which runs biology is sort of the sequence of DNA, you know, codons,
yeah,
things like that. Digital
so
medium
information.
in
So
a sort of way.
my favorite title on this paper was "Where's Your Evidence, Screamed Dawkins?" Fine-tuning, physical constants appear just right. This paper argues that the meta-observer is choosing the most computationally efficient Ruli or region, i.e. there's rich attractor structures here. That is fine-tuning. So it's like hard fine-tuning. It's like the hardest form of fine-tuning that you can possibly imagine is what this paper proposes. It says that this must be the most computationally efficient universe, i.e. it's like a Leibnizian best of all possible worlds. And it actually is the best of all possible worlds. We are in the most computationally efficient one. And so the anthropic principle comes, the hard anthropic principle, fine-tuning is hard fine-tuning. Then you also have things like convergent evolution of discoveries that effectively are optimal for integrating information across very disconnected parts of the evolutionary tree. And these are because that part of computational possibility space is rich with strong attractors. So the interpretation here is evolution isn't a blind watchmaker, it's constrained search guided by physical law, pre-structured spaces, and environmental information, and ultimately the architecture of the Ruliad in this sort of top-down construction itself, right? So that overall architecture drives these gradients, drives these fine-tunings, drives this efficiency. And the implication is that survival and reproduction are instrumental for computational persistence, but the deeper goal is to integrate accessible computational structure as efficiently as possible, i.e. to integrate as much information as you can. So now we look at it in terms of complexity classes. They reflect in Wolfram's findings on evolution, right? So when Wolfram has done his experiments on evolution in Turing machines, and sort of these they jump, they go through flat periods for a while, then they find a rule that makes them evolve and last longer. This is kind of how I see the observer complexity increasing. They jump. So you go from sort of fundamental particles, which are not minimal observers, to atoms, there's a jump because you go from no observer to observer. Then you get molecules, combinatorial explosion versus atoms, big jump. Then you get life, another huge jump because you get self-replication with heritability in bounded environments. Then you get mind, and you get integrated experience and self-modeling in an abstract way. And then you get culture, which is another jump. And this reflects sort of how information grows, right? So, you can look at classes here and go, what are the observation mechanisms of the classes? If you look at molecules, you have sort of conformal scanning, vibrational spectroscopy, bonding networks, reactivity as observation mechanisms for life, chemotaxis, right? Gradients, quorum sensing, gap junctions. For mind, neurons are specialized apparatus, network topology, clustering and path length, plasticity, right? So you get in these classes different mechanisms that have different information integration potential, comparative. Now I've mapped this again to, different parts of history, right? So the observational arc of history, and you can see, I won't go through this page in detail, but you can see that like we get these mapping to these colors. But we look at we sort of look at atoms, and then we look at how this book scales through time. And then we also moved to human development. And again, the correspondence to cosmic development is quite unusual. And these maps are all maps of the same thing, and they're all different maps at different scales. And it sort of speaks to the idea that the Ruliad is this giant map of all maps. And I think that you can do these mappings in a reasonably formal way to show the correspondences. It feels quite fractal. It's like multi-scale up and down at different sizes, and it's self-similar. And you get this self-similarity in every possible observer class, in every possible way of looking at things with an observer-centric framework. Telos. So we've seen like the converging threads here of physics. We have symmetry breaking quantum fields, structured bounded observable universe. We have evolution, biological and cultural evolution, pre-riding existing information gradients, building increasingly powerful observers, and observers and complexity classes tracking how much or how deeply the universe or this meta observer can observe the infinite, right? The everything. And this is quite provocative because it says that like the story of our universe is information integration at all scales. So it's taking IIT and going, you're right, but it's actually everything's doing this. And I think that everything from the most fundamental minimal observer all the way up to us, we just do it in a more complex, more detailed way. And we can now make this precise, like what is telos? How do we formalize these information gradients and hierarchies in the Ruliad? And how do we connect this to consciousness, meaning, and ethics? This is pretty basic for guys like you, but you need, the way I think about this is in terms of computational complexity, right? I think of path lengths, I think of computational complexity. Look at O1, one step, ON, n steps, O2 to the n explodes with n, and then this unreachable part O infinity, i.e. this is the point that takes you to sort of the compactifying point in the Ruliad, the closure point, no finite morphism chain for bounded observers, right? So that's just a placeholder to say you can't get there, but when people talk about mystical experience or direct connection to God, when they have like, when you have like prophets or you have like, a priest who's sort of communing with God, that's what they say they're doing, right? Now, connecting this back to the Ruliad, O1 is information directly accessible from your current state. ON is information as n hypergraph updates away. ON squared means you're exploring a 2D region of the Ruliad, like a random walk or diffusion. O2 is the power of n, is like a multi-way explosion, information buried in the exponential branching of this Ruliad. And then O infinity, fundamentally unreachable. Complexity measures the length and structure of the morphism chains you must traverse to find a desired state or, a relevant state for you, given your observer function. And then the question is, given limited computational resources, which paths should observers invest in? Which strategies minimize cost per bit of useful information gained, right? How do I link this back to integrated information? And that's how I'm looking at that and looking at that for telos. So information gradients in the Ruliad, the claim here, and this is a claim, is that it's not a flat topos. It has gradients from low to high density that reflect the structure I described in the Kabbalistic Cosmogenesis section. It says that we have domains, we have like a singularity at the start in our physical universe, a minima, right? And then we have this true infinity topological closure, which is like all computations complete, it must be maximal information density. And you see here that most things access these domains, and the color of the bars say how much we access of each. So humans, we get more integrated information across more domains than, say, an animal, but an animal can still feel, emotions. And also plants can feel emotions. We know that that's been sort of discovered now as something akin to emotions. And then we've got atom at the bottom, which maybe doesn't. But you get this sense that this is a universal thing that you can define universal observers against. And then we talk about information hierarchies, and we talk about how much energy is required to access them comparative to other parts of that hierarchy. So I give these things labels. So P domain physical direct observables, V domain inferable patterns, the S domain is computable structures, the M domain is like intuitable archetypes like logic, symbols. And then you have this sort of undifferentiated infinity that you can't really imagine. And the point here is that you have different types of domain being different types of discovery mechanics help find out information or integrate information about these domains. So the physical domain and the valuational domain, science is exceptionally good at it, and it covers those domains with high proof, right? It means that they get computationally reduced in structure, so we can say a lot about them. Computable structures in the S domain, that's like math, right? That's the world of math. So math is I'm not a believer in sort of thermodynamic, information that physics eventually eats maths. I think maths eats physics. It's a bigger possibility space. And then you have like intuitable archetypes where Dugan, your art sits. Like this thing is covering a lot of stuff. It's saying a lot, like your 9-dimensional object reduced to 2D is saying something deep about structure, but it's hard to extract what it's saying. And then you have sort of what is mysticism, which is what Moses on the mountain, or Muhammad in the cave, or Christ in the desert. That's what they're talking about over there.
Right. It's like art is a computation that like funnels into aesthetics, and then these myths are stories which funnel into like how we feel inside.
Yeah. They have causal coverage over those lower domains, right? Your art specifically, right? Your art is literally all about symmetries. So even though you don't need to know anything about 9-dimensional hyperspheres to know about your Penrose periodic tiling, right? When you look at it, it aesthetically does something, as you already know.
Yeah.
You go down, but because you're Dugan and you're an exceptional mathematician, that you're also doing the computable part in the S domain. You're also getting the feeling from that of wow when you do that. The V domain. And then we've got the P domain, which is like hopefully this output on the canvas that we're making together. So you get the full suite, but the integrated object, the full object is the art itself, right? And you can get more from the bottom domains than say someone else. Do you get the delta? The delta is that your causal coverage of your art is actually higher than the maths you do in the physics project, but it's integrated in a better way. And so the reason that higher domains contain and constrain the lower ones is that a pre-image of the lower domain exists in the higher domain. It's like a nested hierarchy. It's not disjoint. It's joined up. And observers move integrated information upwards from raw data to value-laden meaning to abstract insight to your art. And religions have intuited this hierarchy, and this exists in Kabbalah, in Hinduism, also in Platonic forms versus matter. It might all be in different languages, but they are talking about a singular structure. Information integration is universal telos. So the conjecture is that we maximize our integrated information subject to our boundedness and persistence. The intuition is that we integrate information to predict better, survive longer, and spawn more observers or sub-agents to explore the space. It aligns with biology, organisms that sense, integrate and respond better, outcompete others. Culture, societies that compress and share knowledge thrive, and that's like empirical as well. This isn't me pulling out of air. Spirituality, traditions that guide attention towards deeper or larger structures persist, and that is exactly what we see in history. Otherwise, we would probably still have shamanism or animism or polytheism. And this allows a definition of meaning as a computable-ish quantity. And this is a heuristic, but meaning is the integral over total information content from an observation, observer relevance, how much it matters to their internal model, and the temporal persistence. And what I've tried to show is that on sort of a three-dimensional graph where, I've got checking email at the bottom, gives you some information, it's persistent, has low relevance, and then like raising a child. And we go out to like the edge of that graph, right? Or profound insight. You come up with, you're Stephen and you come up with a Ruliad. That might be a profound insight that goes very high up. Empirical support for telos. Now, this is pretty early and it's really only Levin's lab that's doing this, but I think this is probably one of the most interesting things because telos has been out of scientific discussion for probably more than 150 years, at least majorly. I think biology, you see it heuristically in nervous systems, sensory organs, and all increase the integrated information per unit energy. Culture, writing science, digital technologies, externalize, compress, and share information at lower costs. And then you have actual on-the-ground empirical experiments from Michael Levin's lab, xenobots, regenerative morphogenesis, non-neural cognition, telos-like behavior wherever there is capacity to store and process information. And then bringing it back to the Ruliad and observer theory, systems that don't integrate information die out to entropy. They lose their boundary over time. Systems that do become more complex observers that therefore have more causal influence. And it's consistent with Darwinian selection, but just informationally, no free lunch constraints. And we see it in observed acceleration of complexity through time. So these are all observational. I've I've done little basic chart, but you have like a xenobot on the left, a monkey, Michael Levin, and then you have civilization because I like that game, and those all have more capacity. So why do we form civilizations? Because they allow us as a group of they're like a smaller meta observer that allow us to do more. Efficient search. Observers at every scale evolve optimal strategies for exploring computational possibility space given their constraints. Strategies get more complex and sophisticated, balancing exploration, finding new information, and exploitation using computationally reduced knowledge. I've got sort of 5 core ones and a 6th, which is claimed. So some of these you'll probably know off the top of your head, but Brownian motion is the sort of lowest class, and that's like, the molecule floating through the air. It will eventually cover all of the space, but there's no memory and it's huge redundancy and it's slow. Then you get gradient following, which is like the next step up. Faster local optima, biologically easy, but can get stuck in local maxima or local optima, plateau problem, and normally need a smooth fitness landscape. Then you get to sort of animals, memory-based search, planning, limits re-exploration, so less redundancy, and it supports deeper goal direction, and you get to update your maps, so you get the beginnings of a iterable internal model. Then you get to us, symbolic reasoning allows big leaps because you go to a domain that has more causal coverage. So a math theorem can impact a lot of things. A physics theorem impacts a lot of sub objects, a lot of things that you can do. So if you come up with a new mathematics theory, you can then potentially come up with new physics, you can then come up with new engineering objects, etc., etc. So the causal coverage of symbolic reasoning, that's what I mean by allows leaps. It gives you enormous compression of information and it's cooperative. But symbol systems can be misaligned with reality. And we in fact find that in our language, right? If I describe a word to you because you've got a different causal history to me, that word will have a slightly different meaning at the edges than it will mean for me. And we also have the overfitting problem. And then you have sort of the theoretical limit in our universe, quantum search, parallel search of many possible branchial paths, like Grover-like limits, but you do have a problem type specificity and coherence problem. And then at the very end, you have what's claimed by sort of prophets and religious people, to link it back to the original thing: direct mystical knowing, idealized limit, O1 for certain structural truths, may sample patterns that may be computationally expensive to derive step by steps. And this is what you kind of see with people who do very heavy amounts of meditation or very high amounts of psychedelics. So, evolution of informational efficiency. Why is efficient search better? Now, this walks through that. Again, I've summarized the left-hand side, so I won't do it again. But the point is, observers that can pay the upfront cost gain huge long-term advantages in integrating information, and natural selection favors architectures implementing more efficient search strategies. And you can see what I've done is map that back to sort of classes of observers: early life, near random search of weak gradients, bacteria, chemotaxis and proper gradient following, animals, memory, maps and reinforcement learning, humans, symbolic logic, and civilizations and AI, which are like the next step up from us because they're constructions of synthetic, like meta observers, distributed search, simulation, high dimensional observations. I look at an LLM, it's working in 20, 30 layers. We're not working in that many. That gives you more possibility space to access. And this trajectory is universal. And this, linking it back to the sort of God conjecture, is our meta observer bootstrapping ever more efficient searches. And all I'm saying here is survival is derivative optimization. Like, survival is crucial, but it's derivative to this fundamental optimization of evolution. Implications. What are ideas? Ideas are superstructures. So that ride on top of sufficiently complex observers, so they're much faster. They phase transition in how information is organized and integrated for observers like us. And the question is, if the universe is computational and telic, what roles do those play in shaping reality? Ideas means information patterns that can achieve autonomous existence by replicating between minds. Genes are slower, ideas are faster. And once you have observers that can symbolize and communicate, you basically get this new layer on top of biological evolution that just works infinitely faster. And that's that phase transition I'm talking about when you move from humans to culture. It means that you're faster, you get quicker. It means that you integrate information faster, so you start to experience. So the way I see this, Dugan, is like a sigmoid style curve, right? Where you have like a flat line at the bottom for a very long time. You sort of get to us and we get to our culture and we're on like the bit of the exponential, and then we'll asymptotically approach some integrated information maxima. And that's kind of I think the shape of this type of observer-centric model. The formal structure of ideas. Look, I've created a sort of first cut of a tuple for how this would look, right? What's the data structure of an idea? It's like the pattern, the replication rules, its fitness function, its mutation rate. I think the pattern is the core integrated information structure, like the overall concept. And the replication rules are how it spreads and sticks for observers like us. And that might be emotion in the valuational domain. It might be cognitive fit in the symbolic domain. If I give you a new theory of quantum physics, Dugan, you're going to go, that doesn't, because I'm not a physicist, you will go, that is wrong, Sam. Please do not give me another theory of physics. It won't have cognitive fit for you. P domain, pragmatic utility. Does it help you achieve more goals? And then all domains, the coherence of those ideas. So conformity to your historic causal graph. How easy is it for you to integrate that information given your current causal graph? And then the fitness function is how effectively it replicates under given conditions. And the mutation rate is how much it changes, like Chinese whispers, between each idea. And in the context of the Ruliad, they're structured as objects in the S domain, in that symbolic domain that can be copied between observers. And what they do is they spawn new morphisms. So you get new morphisms accessible in the valuational domain, in the physical domain, and in the symbolic domain from an idea. So one theory produces many sub-theories. If I turn around and I insult you, Dugan, you might get a new pattern that goes, I'm going to be peed off now. I'm going to be annoyed at Sam. and then you might turn off the live stream. That's your new morphism from the idea, right? So you can literally map these things, and like that's a very trivial example, but it gives you a sort of intuition of how this is thinking about it.
But yeah, no, a new idea, a new piece of information will enable different processes from there.
Exactly right. So what does this do? Well, I now have a new evolutionary arena where evolution was historically looking at persistence, and now it's looking at attention and memory, predominantly boundedness, right? This is how we lower our boundedness over time. Because these ideas are stable attractors in the symbolic domain of the Ruliad, that symbolic algorithmic space, and they're analogous to biological niches in physical space. So you get this again, self-similarity as you work up observer complexity classes that I think is quite powerful, but you only get it if you have the structure at the top going in this sort of nested order. So it links all back together. So even though I'm now really into observer theory and like development of it, without the first bit or without this ground that I'm constructing it from, I don't have anything. And that's why this has to be done as sort of, it's a long paper, but it gets done together. Then this, look, I want to get through this before we have to go to bed. But these are sort of ideas of how ideas shape lower domains, so how they have causal influence, and you can get mechanisms for this. But I'll pass over that page because I think we get it from that. And then the evolution of ideas. So what is the mimetic selection pressure? What are the selection pressures? Explanatory power. Thank you, David Deutsch, Beginnings of Infinity. Germ theory beating miasma theory because it's more predictive. And the takeaway is it must compress regularities more efficiently to be more useful, i.e. it must be more computationally reducible. That's what observers are discovering, pockets of computational reducibility. Emotional resonance. Ideas that activate emotions are more memorable as they touch more observers' causal graphs, more causal points in their causal graphs. Social utility. Don't murder enables societal stability, timeless and placeless. They solve a coordination problem amongst disjoint observers or observers that don't share causal histories. Practical utility. Scientific ideas that enable more observation, electricity, antibiotics, ideas with repeatable, tangible benefits gain wide adoption. Simplicity. An eye for an eye is persistent because everyone gets it. Not everyone gets the full law. Simple ideas spread faster, subject to more distributed interpretation based on observers' variable causal history or their light cone. High fitness ideas compress regularities and integrate information across observers' accessible domains. But how does this interact with meaning? So this construction is basically looking at the integrated information on the meaning of an idea, and it looks at the information content of observation X, the relevance and the persistence, and it approximates this over all observers, all time, and all possible observations across the entire accessible topos, the field of observation, to the limit. So this is like when I talk about what's that internal mechanism, what's that thing that an observer is doing top down to basically compute within their field from T1 to T2, they're doing this. And in plain English, what are you looking for? Structure, how much it matters to your goals and survival, and whether it endures. High meaning, lots of info, highly relevant, long-lived. Zero meaning, high info, but no structural relevance. Pure noise. Meaning and information gradients. And this, why did I do that? Because it lets us compare where meanings concentrate. So I've done it in a domain way. So physical domain, high substrate importance, but low semantic meaning per state. Valuational domain, high relevance and medium persistence. Symbolic domain, high information, often very high or permanent persistence. Minimally constrained, higher stability, and cross-observer invariance. So logic, abstract structures, archetypes, they are the same for all humans. They are effectively eternal, right? Or close to eternal. And then you have this infinite limit, the maximal point of this information gradient, which is perfect persistence and maximal density, but is inaccessible to bounded observers. And then with a teleological reading, when religions talk about like the will of God, what they're talking about is optimal information gradients pulling observers towards that closure point through these domains in the most efficient way. And you can see, like, I've done it here, right? So something like category theory is like a minimally constrained part of the domain. It's very abstract. Go to Shabak, symbolics, emotions, cell, right? I need to survive. And then finally, at the very end, we get to computational ethics. So I promise you, we are in the home stretch. We are nearly done. I guess to summarize the argument so far, reality as we know it is only possible computationally to observers like us, i.e., we only understand things in cause and effect, and the Ruliad is our limit of our ability to say things about it. Observers are bounded samplers with universal telos. Maximize integrated information as quick as you can. Ideas and cultural systems form higher order structures that shape what observers can do. And this raises a question. If the universe is structured and telic, what does that imply about ethics? This paper claims that morality is not invented, it is discovered, and that ethical behavior is the mathematically optimal behavior exploring the fastest or the steepest information gradients for the most possible observers. Virtue and sin are about information integration versus informational entropy for self-referential observers like us. And what I'm going to show here is that the observational loop that Xerxes talks about is necessary and universal. Ethics emerges as computational cost minimization for observers in the Ruliad subject to computational irreducibility, and major religions and philosophical traditions converge because they discover the same universal optima. Here's the observer loop. Now I've built out, like I've turned the Xerxes formalism into simple language, or translated it back into plain English. But mapping these, when we send something, we restrict R to the relevant inputs, we integrate information, we update our internal state and compress those inputs into an internal model. When we evaluate, we compute the predicted value utility of our possible actions. When we select an action, we choose according to our internal objective function, which is variable across different observers like us. So some of it's the same, but there's like an edge component that's variable based on who you are, your past. You act, you apply GX and change the environment and the future inputs. You update your internal model for prediction errors, you learn, and then you network and exchange information with other observers to build a broader causal graph, right? A broader network model, and you iterate it and repeat it. And that applies from the smallest observer, an atom, to us. It's the same, it's universal. I don't think you can find an observer that doesn't do these things. At least that's the conjecture. The conjecture is that every possible observer must do these steps. Otherwise, if they don't do them regularly, they no longer persist as an observer. Connecting this loop to local entropy reduction. So what have I done in here? I've put these into the Ruliad's categorical structure, and I've said sense is R to using your sampling functor. You have a composition that limits, you evaluate, you do natural transformations, you execute the morphism, you modify your functor, you then couple between other observers, and then you compose and iterate. So these, I've tried to then place this back in the language of the formalism. And then here's the functor components, and then its role in informational entropy reduction, right? Filters are, the first one, sensing filters are, when you integrate, you build a model, you compress patterns, you evaluate, you apply your predictive model, you select, you choose the low cost or high meaning morphism with imperfect knowledge, right? So you won't get this right all the time because you're computationally bounded. You act, you impose constraints on the evolution of your field of observation, or R0, depending on what you're doing. You update, you refine your model, learning more, you add more compression to your model. You network, you share compressed models to your local neighborhood, and then you give entropy reduction to your connected observers, and you iterate that to the limit. So globally, entropy still increases, but locally observers create neg entropy, life, knowledge, stable societies. And ethics is ultimately a study of what choices maximize information integration per unit entropy, and which choices throw away information and accelerate disorder. And that is computationally, I think, how you can set ethics in the Ruliad. Choice is computational optimization. So here I'm defining a path cost function. So the morphism chains for a path Y through the Ruliad from states S1 to S2, the total cost is the number of steps, the number of steps, the entropy generated, the distance to the convergence point, and the network effects on other observers. And I've given something on the right for intuition. So these are sort of toy functions at the moment, but they say helping a stranger feels good. So the amount of computational steps is small, low effort. The disorder created is low, trivial. You decrease the distance because of positive network effects. There's a gain to other observers, so you choose it. It's low cost. Lying to avoid computation feels bad. Computational steps low initially to avoid the conversation. High entropy generation as you must maintain the consistency of that lie in your world model through multiple forward steps, i.e. it compounds. The distance increases as two observers' world models diverge from convergence. And the network value is negative because there's an entropic cascade if it reveals. If I lie to you, Dugan, and say, if I lie to you, then you're not going to listen to me next time. High, avoid. Ethical behavior equals optimal path selection. So if we have two paths, a virtual, y1 virtuous, y2 sinful, and they're from your current state to convergence or completion of all possible computations, then the cost of the virtuous one will be less than the cost of the sinful one, i.e. I'm applying sort of religious or philosophical ethical notes to computational language now. And I'm saying the integrated information from the virtuous path will be higher than the sinful one. The entropy generated from a virtuous decision will be lower than a sinful one. And the time to reach computational completion will be quicker in a virtuous path than a sinful path. And this falls out of the structure of the observable Ruliad, the universal loop that we've talked about, and the telos of climbing information information gradients from less dense to more dense, i.e. from this construction all the way through, you get ethics, right? So if I take this all the way down, I get computational models of ethics at the very end of it. And then I've just put that paths that maximize information integration, minimize entropy, speed up convergence, sin, the opposite. Then we have to add one more new object to here, which is computational debt, because not all choices are equal. Computational debt are choices that appear optimal in the short term due to our boundedness and computational irreducibility of the structure, but those choices require extensive additional computation to integrate coherently later. This is a conjectured definition, but it says that the choice at time t is sort of the integral of the cost of the ongoing computational cost of the actual choice, less the cost of the optimal choice. And the intuition is that the extra computation is needed to maintain the suboptimal pattern, like a lie, addiction, or even when you code. Like if you do bad code that's messy, you're going to have to fix it later. The trade-off is between convenience now versus additional complexity, entropy, and lost chance. And this explains why sometimes when we make choices that are high effort or create entropy because they are doing something hard at the beginning, why those choices still work in this structure, because you have some debt from doing the simple thing that's easy to do. And this is an example with lying. Lying is something that's, in every religious and every moral tradition is normally thought of as bad, right? There's not one society that thinks lying is good, or lying is good within that society, because there are some societies that think lying is good to people outside the society. But truth, high emotional cost now, no future cost, lie, low cost now. But after t equals 0, extra modeling. Remember what you said, extra constraints, fewer morphism options, extra risk, discovery and network collapse, and extra energy expenditure, anxiety and monitoring of the choice. And that extra computational work could have been spent on learning, discovery, exploring new morphisms, therefore suboptimal. Convergence. So many traditions have figured out that major ethical systems around the world approximate the same computational optima despite being disconnected. I've given examples from religion, but I could also give examples from secular ethics, right? And meta ethics. They all get to the same point. And I guess the conclusion is ethics are not it's the opposite of postmodernist thoughts on ethics. They are not arbitrary cultural strips. They are local approximations of a universal optimization problem. So I think postmodernism is totally wrong. Ethics are not based on where you're from. They're not like relative. They are actual. They are actuals. And I think it speaks to like, I'm like a mathematical Platonist. I think math is discovered, not invented. I think ethics are discovered, not invented. Again, I'm using a computational framework because I think computation is discovered and not invented.
Mm-hmm.
And like to wrap this up, I've done these for the 7 Noahide laws and the 4 Noble Truths in Buddhism. These took the 7 Noahide laws in very short form are the universal ethical minimum for civilization. They're like the categories of rules that you can derive all other laws from that give you stable civilizations. And in Judaism, they're in fact the only 7 laws that they think everyone should follow globally. So this is why they are high compression and they're basic ethical categories to derive all sub rules. And I've given some reasons and reasons for that below, but I'll let people read them. And then in Buddhism, the 4 Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path are more like a personal observer optimization. How do I reduce my entropy? How do I do that? These are the things I should do. The Eightfold Path is, minimize your prediction error, optimize amongst observers, computationally efficient observer communication. These are all personal. The 7 Noahide laws are like civilizational. So they're different ways of saying the same thing at different levels of description. Implications and predictions. So you can look at these at all the levels, like many of these traditions have, and say, what can you sketch from this and this is really early because this is still being figured out, but effectively we're saying we can quantify computational ethics with information theoretic measures in these types of functions, and that you should be able to do that with better modeling skills than I have across agents and LLMs, that you can literally trial it with LLMs. You could do it with individuals. You could actually measure this stuff. And I think that that's what's quite interesting about this computational framework comparative to, say, philosophical ethical models. Like they assert things in philosophy, but they don't do experiments. And I think here with this type of model, this is something that's sort of very conjectured, but I think you can design experiments to test this empirically. And I think that you can test it. And that's why I think it's really interesting, because it says actually ethics can now be a science or part of a science and not just philosophy and not just a bunch of philosophers arguing, because that doesn't get you answers. Here, what I'm really saying is ethics are like reality's operating system. We have hardware that's the Ruliad, we have your kernel that's physics, we have your OS that's computational ethics, and then you have your apps, which are cultures, institutions, and individuals. And this is a computational view of reality that I think has utility, because as you can see, what I'm doing here is connecting disconnected domains in a computational superstructure. I'm not saying the world is a big computer, right? I'm not saying that. I'm saying that you can model the world to an arbitrary degree of accuracy as a very complex big computer, which is a slightly different thing. And I think that's something to say. And I think that, linking it back to the theology, the closure point of the Ruliad has properties that we traditionally attribute to God, as we've seen. Perfect justice is optimal pattern arrangement. Max info, minimum entropy. Perfect love is maximal observer coupling. And these correspond to mathematical limits of the observer's optimization function. So this all links back to the very first bit on how we're going to show that a God concept can be conciliant with physics in a computational universe. We're linking it back all the way out to ethics. And then, like you get some answers, okay, they're pretty trivial, but you say, how do you live in a computational universe? When we combine the Ruliad, observer theory, universal telos, and ethics, we get a practical set of answers. Why am I here? To integrate information and create meaning at all levels, personal to societal. What should I do? Choose actions that maximize virtue, minimize sin and computational debt, given your constraints and unique causal history. What's life's purpose? to serve as the universe, observing itself as cleanly, deeply, and lovingly as you can, right? And then you'll have your different religious overlays as to what those things are. But this is like stripping back all of those things to the sort of core algorithm that underpins them. And then the consequences, right? Treat your attention and choices as scarce computational resources. Try to build things, build networks, and be humble and know that you won't reach perfect knowledge, but know that your personal path towards it matters enormously because you are like your own very, very specific, specialized ultra filter that can do it in your own special way. Like the poetic way of saying it is postmodernism is wrong. You're not an accident in a meaningless void. You are necessary and unique as an observer in a computational totality, exploring an infinite possibility space. You matter because you are the only person with your specific lens to accomplish that thing. And so every person matters, and everyone should try and focus on what they're actually good at because it doesn't have to be, I will never be as good as you at maths or physics, but I can be good at other things like putting on a good art show. And that might be my good way of doing it. This is like I like that out of this you fall out with something that says meaning is intrinsic. Like meaning is built into the system. And I think that I love, there's I think philosopher called John Vervaeke who does this lecture series called We're in the Meaning Crisis. And he talks about it ad infinitum about how the modern world of materialism has caused this meaning crisis, this bifurcation. And I feel like we need a model for how to integrate meaning back into what I call the hard sciences or empirical science. And this is my first stab at trying to do that with the biggest possible model you can build something on. And that's why when I was with Stephen, when we were walking around Hyde Park, that's why I said, this was impossible before this language. Like you couldn't do something like this, and now you can. And I think that it is quite a unique thing that you can do with it. And as I've tried to demonstrate in this talk, this uniqueness is giving me, helpful answers that help me frame how I see things. And then, look, I'm not going to run through this because we've been on this for 2.5 hours, but you can please upload this. I've done some analogies and some that show, these computational ideas applied to Genesis and in good, getting a soul, naming and Eve, and also the bad and why the bad is necessary. I think the summary here is this isn't clever exegesis, right? Taken together, right? What is ensoulment in Genesis? It's the awareness of the global optimization landscape. Naming is giving Adam tools for efficient search. Eve is relational architecture for extended coverage, i.e. coupling. And the fool, right? Why is the fool necessary? Because if you know the best choice from walking with God, you will only take one choice. You reduce your choice set to a singleton. With the fool, you get to explore the whole topos. You reintroduce epistemic uncertainty. And that is good because religions say your humans are made to be the most godlike creature. And what is the most godlike thing? The most godlike thing is the thing with maximal creative choice, the thing with maximal choice, and the wisdom or knowledge to make the right choice. So if you only have one choice because you know the right choice, you will only make that choice. Therefore, you can't be more godlike without having the possibility of error. And the whole job of sort of humanity and religions is to sort of get better at that and have access to all the choices, but choose to make the right one. And this I've tried to show on like an information gradient landscape. Pre-soul, we have a local maxima. We know pre-soul, right? So Adam is not the first man in Judaism. He's like a tribe of men. It's the first set of men with awareness of God, right? Or awareness of this global optima. So societies pre-Adam, Aztecs, etc., they might have got quite advanced, but they had suboptimal cultural practices, child sacrifice, etc., that meant they were trapped in local minima. And then Adam gets his soul, and they suddenly get visibility of the global optima, and you get with sort of the fall and the first sin, you get a quick sampling of the global minima with the first murder, right? So you have all of these interesting things that you can apply to, and this doesn't just apply to like Genesis, you can do it all the way through the Bible, you can do it in every tradition. And the invitation is to people in those traditions with their expertise that I don't have to apply these computational ways of looking at their religion to it and go, well, if I look at, and then you have a common language of what these religions are saying across each tradition in something that's easy to state in logic or to state in order, to state in cause and effect, that's not using all that. So you see the convergence between these in a much clearer way. And I guess what we're trying to say is that this paper goes beyond traditional theology by explaining why these stories are structurally necessary. And it goes beyond reductive materialism by treating consciousness, morality, and meaning as necessary features of observer-based computation. Like that is the point here. Finally. And then, so why have I done this? I prefer precise breakable conjectures over vague, unfalsifiable metaphysical comfort blankets. And so what I've done at the top is connect the Ruliad, observers, physics, evolution, telos, ideas, and ethics in a very lossy map that hopefully people can improve. And, there is what's new and what's not new. It's not new to use computation as a lens on physics or information and complexity to talk about life or mind or recognizing ethical convergences across traditions. But what we add is an isomorphism claim about God and the Ruliad, an observer-first framing of basically everything, a universal telos that you can test, computational ethics that you can test, and concrete computational theology and ethics research directions. So the idea is that I want kind of people to test this and try and break it apart, but that's the sort of the idea. And yeah, that is all, finally. So thank you very much for that. And I'm sorry I took so much of your time.
Oh, it's perfectly fine. That's amazing. Such a broad range of topics. I really like the um, the way you thought about all of this. Uh,
Dude, it's
I
been
especially
two
like
and a half
the
years to
computational
do
ethics.
this.
Um, the ethics is sort of the computation of gradient descent, path selection, trying to optimize observers and their agency in relation to the emergent properties of how different individual observers interact with each other.
I haven't even put the section on coupling in yet. Like I left it out.
Yeah.
I have a whole section on coupling, a whole section on human superstructure. Like, so to give you context, right? This work is not just me. I've had
Uh-huh. Of course,
enormous amounts.
it's
So
not just
I,
in isolation.
this is like built on the great work, like it's built on Stephen's formalism. It's
Hmm.
built on a huge amount of time Stephen, James, Hatem, Xerxes spent with me teaching me the basics of the formalism when I came with these ideas in a really lossy way. I've had, a physicist check all my maths. I've had PhD biologists and evolutionary biologists check the logic of the arguments in the evolution section. I've had psychologists check the ethics arguments and philosophers. So this has been like a huge amount of like iteration and work over the past 2 years to get to this paper. Um, and it's something that when I got invited to come by James, that I just thought I would never do. This is just not on my plate, like at all. And so I feel like it's saying something new and saying something new in a unique way that I can't find. I looked at computational theology in sort of academic literature.
Hmm.
It's not doing anything like this. It's like, it's so narrow, like it
Yeah,
just
there are a
felt
few
narrow.
like inputs into that sort of concept space. I mean, I remember Thomas Aquinas kind of having a computational framework for ethics in a very limited way. Uh,
Yes, because they don't have the language, right? Like I'm not, like the language that, Jonathan Xerxes came up with the category-theoretic formalism, but also the constructivist bent in sciences over the past really 5 or 6 years, since constructor theory, but also assembly theory, also people like Edward Frenk, also like Nima Arkady-Hamid talking about Platonic spaces and telos again for the first time in over 100 years, right, is like an unusual, it's a confluence of factors that let this sort of paper be written and not just be hand wavy, and that is, I think, we're in quite a unique time where I think these models of process, like the Ruliad, which is I think the meta model of all these process orientated ontologies,
Mm-hmm.
is going to be the thing, because it's going to give us a lot more explanatory power, a lot more bang for buck than the sort of separate magisteria of pure materialism and separate frameworks. It just doesn't do the job anymore. And that's being a bit mean to string theorists and all these other people, but I feel like if we can say big things again, we should try and say big things. That's like, if it's wrong, it's wrong. Great. Someone will prove, if someone shows that this is really wrong, I'll be exceptionally happy. And I'll be like, great, give me the right thing. And that's the best thing about it, because you can really, I want this to be kicked and kicked a lot.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
yeah,
It's open for input.
but yeah. Anyway, I'm conscious I kept you for nearly 3 hours, mate. So
Sam, I just thank you so much. Um, Fascinating
I'll
work.
be sending. I just also want to say one quick thank you to the Open Research Institute, ORI. They're a metics research institute, so they study the spread of ideas, and a lot of the things, particularly in Christian metaphysics, that I learned, a lot of the stuff around the ideas and a lot of the sketching of a lot of these ideas happened with them, and they've been exceptionally helpful. A guy called Omar Shiata leads that, and is doing sort of memetics work, which is like how ideas spread across social media, how to map these spaces.
Mm-hmm.
And they've been exceptionally helpful, and a great forum, have been giving me comments on this paper for a few months. So I wanted to say thank you to them as well, and also thank you to everyone at Wolfram.
Oh, that's great. Um, in the video description for this live stream, would it be all right if I put a link to your paper
This
if it's
paper,
ready somehow, or if it's
yeah,
not ready?
the paper's literally, I mean, I'm gonna send it to James, and I'll send it to James and the guys tomorrow. It will be put
Okay.
up on a GitHub. I think a public GitHub will also have it, because I think James is gonna put it on
Uh-huh.
the Institute's website. I don't think the paper's not drafted for archive, because even though it probably should go on there, because I am a big fan. Speaking to Stephen about this, but I want plain English context in these sorts of papers, and lots of, diagrams and things that make it easy for the interested science or for lay reader.
Mm-hmm.
And I got told by Xerxes that I couldn't do that for the other paper either, so I doubt I'll be able to do it for this one. But yeah, I'd love it. Yeah, loved. There'll be a GitHub link that I'll send you as well, where people can comment and give comments on the paper live. And yeah, brilliant. And if you want to put this presentation up, then be my guest.
Yeah, the slides
Brilliant.
too. I can do that. I can put a link. I guess you can send me the slides and
Sure.
I'll post it, and
All right,
we'll
dude.
just go from there. And
Yeah, I hope, like I said, like James, when I told him about this paper, was like, you should probably break this into like 4 or 5 papers. And now looking at the fact that it takes nearly 3 hours to talk it through from start to finish, probably means he's right. So yeah.
yeah, it covers
Anyway,
a wide range of domains, so I think it is sectionable.
yeah, I will let you, with your smarter brain than me, figure out how to cut it apart. My brain can only think of it as one thing now. It's impressive. But anyway, dude, thank you so much for your time, and thank you to everyone at the Wolfram Institute for having me.
Our pleasure. Thank you so much, Sam. Thanks for everyone tuning in
Cheers.
on the live stream. Thank you for your questions. We will see you all again next time.